A dying three-star admiral ripped free from 6 trained men with a single convulsive lunge, his chest wound spraying the wall in a dark arc, and the entire trauma bay went silent with the particular silence that happens right before something goes catastrophically wrong. He was screaming about kill zones and ambush coordinates that didn't exist in any room anyone else could see, and every doctor and security officer pressed back against the walls because none of them had ever seen anything like this. A decorated war commander, reduced to something feral and desperate that said, blood sheeting down his surgical gown, monitors shrieking in 3 different registers. Then the mousy little nurse with the shaky hands stepped through all of them, walked directly into his reach, and said something so quietly that no one in the room caught it. But the Admiral heard it, and he stopped. He stopped like someone had cut the power to every system running inside him simultaneously. He looked at her face, and something broke open behind his eyes. Not relief exactly, but recognition of a very specific and devastating kind. The kind that only exists between people who have been through something that has no civilian name. Before this story goes any further, if you're new here, subscribe right now and hit the bell so you don't miss a single episode. Every week on this channel, we bring you stories exactly like this one. The people who were counted as nothing, written off, pushed to the margins until the moment the truth came out and changed everything. Drop a comment right now telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Like this video if you want to see what happens next. Now let's go back to the beginning, because the beginning is where you find out who she actually was. The trauma bay at Calloway Military Medical Center in Harlan, Virginia, was the kind of place that stripped people down to what they actually were. Not what they claimed on their resume, not what their rank insignia said, not the version of themselves they presented in interviews or during orientation, when orientation, everyone was still trying to make a good impression. What they actually were, underneath all of it, in the ugly specific seconds when everything was moving too fast and the margin for error had collapsed to 0. Nurse Petra Walsh had worked that bay for 14 months, and the staff's verdict on her had been rendered within the first 2 weeks. She was nervous. She was slow to adapt. She had a visible tremor in her left hand when she was tired. And she made the kind of charting errors that suggested someone who didn't fully understand the system she was operating in. Dr. Alec Burrows, the senior trauma attending, had once described her in front of 3 residents as the kind of nurse you tolerate until she requests a transfer. He hadn't bothered to lower his voice. She had been standing 6 feet away with a medication tray in her hands, and he had looked at her while he said it, as though the statement became more accurate with direct eye contact. She had nodded and said she'd work on it. She was a white woman in her early 30s, medium height, with close-cropped dark hair going slightly long at the nape of her neck, a habit of holding her shoulders forward and inward that made her look perpetually braced for incoming weather. She wore her scrubs a size too large. She kept her head down during morning rounds and took notes on a small spiral pad with a mechanical pencil, which the residents found quaint in the slightly contemptuous way that people find things quaint when they want to feel superior. She asked for help with the electronic charting system, more than someone with her seniority should have needed. She apologized reflexively. She deflected questions about her background by giving answers so boring they discouraged follow-up. She made mistakes. Not dangerous mistakes, never that, but the small, visible, credibility-eroding kind. A mislabeled specimen here, a delayed notification there. Enough to establish a pattern, to give the Burrowses of the department something to point at. She seemed in every observable way like someone who had ended up in the wrong career through some combination of stubbornness and poor self-assessment. What nobody in that hospital knew, what nobody in that building could have guessed, because she had spent 5 years ensuring they couldn't, was that Nurse Petra Walsh had performed emergency battlefield surgery in the back of a moving vehicle at night in zero visibility in a country that officially denied she had ever been there. That was a different life. She had closed the door on it deliberately and with both hands, and she intended to keep it closed. That intention lasted until the night Admiral Desmond Cray came through the trauma bay doors. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October. Petra was finishing a chart at the nursing station when the radio traffic started bleeding through the dispatch monitors, fragmented and clipped in the way it always sounded when the situation on the other end was still actively deteriorating. She caught enough of it to build a picture. Male, approximately 60, gunshot wound to the chest, possibly 2 wounds brought in by Navy security personnel following what was being described only as an incident at a private residence. No additional details. ETA, 4 minutes. She pulled on gloves without being asked and moved to the supply cabinet. Dr. Burroughs was already in the bay, along with 2 residents' doctor. Sasha Pryor, who was technically competent and quietly terrified of Burroughs in a way that made her over-defer at critical moments, and Dr. Felix Dan, who was less competent and better at concealing it. 2 trauma nurses, Alonzo Park and Cynthia Reeve, were setting up the supply trays. Hospital security had taken positions near the entry doors, 2 officers initially. Then a 3rd arrived in plainclothes, and the plainclothes detail told Petra that whoever was incoming carried weight beyond the standard admission. When the gurney came through, she understood immediately that the radio had undersold it. Admiral Desmond Cray was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, and still physically formidable, despite the pallor of significant blood loss. 2 wounds, one to the upper left chest with a pressure dressing that had soaked through, one to the lateral right side below the ribs that was being held together by the hand of the Navy corpsman who had ridden in with him. He was conscious, which in trauma was simultaneously useful and dangerous, because the conscience he had was not the kind that cooperated with medical authority. His eyes were moving wrong. Not the unfocused drift of shock, but the rapid, tactical scan of someone who was processing the room as a threat environment. His breathing was fast and shallow adrenaline, overriding pain signals in the way it did in people whose systems had been trained past normal physiological governors. He was gripping the gurney rail with his right hand, so hard the knuckle bones were visible through the skin. Even in transfer, even with 2 gunshot wounds bleeding through their dressings, he was trying to sit up, trying to orient, trying to find the angles. "Admiral Cray, you're at Calloway Medical Center in Harlan," Burroughs said, using the measured authoritative tone he deployed for difficult patients. "You've been shot. We need you to stay still and let us work." Cray's eyes moved to Burroughs and didn't register him as anything relevant. "North Corridor," Cray said. His voice was gravel and effort and something running underneath both. "North Corridor is compromised. Don't let them come around." "There's no corridor situation, Admiral. You're in a hospital." "Get down," Cray said, and the register shifted louder, commanding, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Get down, everyone get—" He came off the gurney. It happened faster than anyone in the room anticipated. He got his legs under him and threw off 2 security officers' grips with a single movement that wasn't violent so much, as it was structurally efficient, the body executing a response it had executed hundreds of times before without consulting the part of the brain that was currently trying to bleed out. He was upright and backing toward the wall before anyone could close the distance, and the IV line ripped free from his arm. Blood began tracking down his forearm from the insertion point. The chest dressing was failing again, a dark bloom spreading through the gauze in real time. "He's going to lose the wound seal," Pryor said, just loud enough. "I see it," Burroughs said tightly. "Security, on my mark." The security officers began moving in a loose arc toward Cray, and Cray read the movement exactly the way it was an encirclement, and his posture shifted into something lower and more dangerous that made two of the officers physically hesitate, which was the worst possible outcome because hesitation in an arc creates gaps and gaps create escalation. Petra set down the IV prep kit she was holding. She walked toward him. Walsh. Burroughs' voice carried a specific warning. Stay back. She didn't stay back. She moved past the officers into the center of the room, with her hands visible at her sides and her pace calibrated to register as non-threatening, without being slow enough to seem cautious. She positioned herself directly in front of him, not to the side, not at an angle, but center, because the center was where you stood when you wanted to exist in someone's visual field as a person rather than a tactical variable. She made herself smaller in the shoulders, without diminishing in presence, that had no clinical name, but a thing that had no clinical name, specific environments that no longer appeared on any document she could be asked to produce. She stopped 3 feet from him. Admiral, her voice was quiet and completely level. Look at me. His eyes moved to her face. She held them. You're safe, she said. Stand down. His breathing didn't change. His eyes did. Something in the rapid movement slowed, some processing happening below the conscious level. Words landing in a register that the combat-triggered brain still recognized, even when the civilian mind was inaccessible. But it wasn't enough. He was still too deep inside it, still running on an architecture that predated anything she could reach with standard language. She stepped in 1 more inch, dropped her voice to almost nothing, a breath of sound, shaped for one person. Raven, this is Nightjar. You're out. Stand down. The effect was immediate and total. Desmond Cray went still. Not the stillness of unconsciousness. It's the stillness of a man who has just heard something that has reorganized his fundamental understanding of what is happening and where he is. His eyes locked onto her face with an intensity that was almost unbearable, the kind of focus that belongs to people who have learned that certain pieces of information carry life or death weight. Nightjar, he said. The word came out wrecked. They said you were gone. They said you? I know, she said quietly. Come down with me now. You're bleeding. He sat down on the gurney's edge. Just sat, without resistance, without argument, as though every system that had been running him upright had received the shutdown command simultaneously. The room exhaled. Burroughs stared at her. She was already reaching for the IV kit. She got the line back in before anyone recovered enough to ask questions. Burroughs retook the lead on the assessment in the way that men like him retake ground loudly, but with unnecessary instruction directed at the residents, repositioning himself as the authority figure in the room by sheer volume of clinical commentary. Petra stepped back to the margin where she normally operated and handed off supplies when asked and charted vitals when directed, and did nothing that would earn a second look. The 2 residents exchanged a look over Cray's chest. She didn't acknowledge it. Cray was sedated for transport to imaging within 12 minutes of arrival. The wounds were serious. The upper chest entry had done pulmonary damage, and the thoracic surgeon on call, Dr. Miriam Ostrowski, was paged immediately. Cray didn't speak again before they rolled him out. But in the last moment, before the sedation took him fully under, his eyes found Petra across the bay, and whatever was in them wasn't the confusion of a combat flashback. It was the recognition of someone who had just seen a dead woman walk. She looked away first and finished her documentation. Alonzo Park found her at the supply cabinet 20 minutes later. So, he said, with the careful casualness of someone who had something specific they wanted to ask. That was something. It was a busy intake, she said. The de-escalation thing. What you said to him. He was combat-triggered. I used language consistent with his operational background. Where did you learn that? She handed him a saline bag. Can you log these? I need to check the Bay 3 patient. He took the bag but didn't move. Petra. She looked at him. Alonzo Park was a good nurse and a fundamentally decent person, and the concern in his face was genuine, which made it more complicated than simple nosiness. She understood the difference. "I'm fine," she said, which was not what he'd asked, but was the only answer she had. Bay 3. She walked away. He let her go. But she felt his attention trailing her down the corridor, and she made a point trailing her down the corridor, and she made a point of letting her shoulders come back in, letting the slight hunch return, letting herself look like someone who had gotten briefly lucky and was already uncertain about it. The first surgery on Cray lasted 4 hours and 12 minutes. Petra wasn't on the surgical team. Her credentialing at Calloway was standard floor nursing. She had built it that way deliberately, keeping every qualification exactly average, nothing that would invite scrutiny from anyone who thought to look. She couldn't scrub in without generating a paper trail she didn't want. Instead, she monitored from the floor, covered 2 other patients, and checked the OR status board with the frequency of someone who had a professional reason to care about the outcome. She told herself it was professional protocol. She didn't examine the statement too closely. The pneumothorax had been worse than the initial imaging. Ostrowski had reportedly spent an extra 47 minutes on a secondary bleed that the CT hadn't flagged, which was the kind of thing that happened when penetrating chest trauma occurred at an angle that imaging didn't fully capture. Cray came out of the OR at 4:14 a.m. and went directly to the surgical ICU. Petra's shift ended at 7:00 a.m. She stayed until 7:52, updating charts that were already current. In the stairwell of the parking structure, she stood with her back to the concrete and breathed for 60 seconds with deliberate, counted precision. In for 4, out for 6. The technique she had learned in a program that officially did not credential nurses. She had said the call sign out loud, in a room with 11 witnesses. The calculation had been sound. He was going to die or cause serious harm without intervention, and no other intervention available was going to reach him in time. She had made the correct call. She understood that. She also understood that correct calls left footprints. She put her phone in her pocket without dialing anyone and walked to her car. She was back on shift at 3:00 p.m. The SICU was 2 floors above her regular assignment, but the medication distribution system gave her legitimate corridor access, and she routed her afternoon breakthrough, the 4th floor east wing, once enough to clock the security posture outside room 6. 2 personnel now, 1 uniformed Navy security, and 1 in plainclothes whose bearing telegraphed Federal without advertising it. She noted the shift rotation time from the posted schedule and moved on. She was 3/4 through a medication round at 6:15 when the rapid response alarm fired. SICU, room 6. She was moving before the overhead page finished, which was its own kind of error. Nurse Petra Walsh was not someone who moved with instinctive urgency toward a crisis, and she knew at least 2 people on this shift who would register the discrepancy. She slowed herself by a fraction at the stairwell door and climbed at a pace that was fast but explainable, and she arrived at the SCU entry 12 seconds behind the rapid response team that was coming from the 3rd floor. Room 6. Cray was in cardiac arrest. The SICU nurse on duty, a man named Terrence, was doing compressions technically, but with a hand position that was going to deliver maybe 60% of the force he intended, and in cardiac arrest 60% was the difference between outcomes. The ventilator was alarming on a pressure fault. The monitor showed ventricular fibrillation, coarse, with enough amplitude remaining that a well-timed shock had a viable window. But that window was measured in seconds, not minutes, and it was closing. Petra moved to the defibrillator. "Stop compressions," she said. "I need to read the rhythm." Terrence looked up at her. "Who?" Stopping. "Reading." She confirmed what the monitor had already told her, positioned the pads, charged the device. Dr. Pryor came through the door with the rapid response team at her back. "What's the VFB? Course window is still there." Clearing. Petra looked at the room. Clear, she delivered the shock. The rhythm broke and reorganized on the monitor-wide complex sinus, slightly irregular, but organized electrical activity with perfusion pressure behind it. A pulse. Terrence confirmed it. Pulse is present. The room came down from its worst possible edge. Pryor assumed clinical authority with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been trained to do exactly that. And Petra stepped back and held herself very still and answered the questions directed at her in the flat, factual terms of someone reporting information rather than defending a decision. When the debrief moment came, and she knew it would come, she gave Pryor the rhythm interpretation, the timing, the jewel setting, and nothing else. She was almost out of the SICU when Pryor said, without looking up from the chart, "Walsh, your defibrillation technique. Where exactly was that trained?" "In service," Petra said. "About 2 years ago." She left before Pryor could decide whether to push it. Burroughs was waiting at the nursing station when she returned to her floor. He didn't yell. The absence of yelling was its own form of communication. From Burroughs, it meant he had moved past the stage where volume was useful and into the stage where he was constructing something. "Walk me through the SICU response." "I was closest when the alarm fired," I responded. "He was in VFib with a shockable window." "You operated the defibrillator without physician oversight." Dr. Pryor arrived immediately following the shock. She arrived after. "The window required an immediate decision." I made it. Burroughs looked at her with the expression of someone assembling a case rather than having a conversation. "In the 14 months you've been on this unit, I have documented 7 charting discrepancies, 3 dislaid physician notifications, and 2 specimens you mislabeled. I've watched you struggle with IV placements on routine patients." He paused. "And in the last 18 hours, you de-escalated a combat-triggered 3-star Admiral using language no one in this department recognized, and independently cardioverted a post-surgical patient ahead of the rapid response team." He picked up a pen and set it down again. That's a significant gap. People perform differently under pressure. Not that differently. He met her eyes. "I'm flagging this for a competency review. You're on restricted duties pending outcome. Medication administration and transport, only no procedures, no clinical decision-making. Notify your charge nurse." He picked up his clipboard and walked away without giving her some space to respond, which was fine. She didn't have a response she could give him. Restricted duties meant medication rounds, documentation, patient transport. She did them. She did them carefully and without deviation, and with the slightly uncertain effect of someone who was processing the professional setback rather than someone who had already cataloged it as a manageable secondary problem. At 9:17 p.m., a man fell into step beside her in the east corridor. He was large in the functional way, the kind of build that came from years of carrying weight at pace rather than from a gym. Hospital security badge, name tag, DeCastle, probably 4042, with a face that had seen significant weather and had stopped making much of it. Nurse Walsh. "Officer Cassell, I heard you had an interesting night last night." He matched her pace without effort. "And an interesting afternoon. It was a demanding shift." "I was Army," he said, before this. 11 years, 2 deployments. She said nothing. "The way you moved in that trauma bay." When the Admiral was up and the whole room was backing away from him. "The way you read the angles before you went in." He paused. "That's not a nursing school skill set. De-escalation training covers a range of techniques. Not those techniques." He wasn't aggressive about it. He said it the way someone states a fact they're confident about. "The call sign you used." I didn't catch the words, but I caught the register. "That was operational language." She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him directly, which was something Nurse Petra Walsh did rarely, and the doing of it now was itself a small departure from character that she noted and filed. She assessed him the way she would assess anyone who had just demonstrated specific knowledge, what he'd said, how he'd said it, what he wanted, whether the wanting had any threat in it. What she'd found was a former soldier who had recognized something he wasn't supposed to be able to name, and who was asking about it plainly instead of reporting it, which was either genuine good faith or a very good imitation of it. I had experience in crisis environments before nursing, she said. I don't discuss it. What kind of environments? Ones that aren't relevant to my current position. He held her gaze for a moment. Okay, he said. I'm not looking for trouble. I just want to understand what I'm looking at. He paused. Because whatever it is, it saved the Admiral's life twice in 18 hours. And I'm not inclined to make that harder than it needs to be. She studied him for 3 more seconds. You're not looking at anything that requires your attention, she said. Have a good night, Officer Cassell. She walked on. He didn't follow. But when she turned the corner at the East Corridor junction, she could feel his attention on her back with the clarity of someone who had spent years learning to feel exactly that. At 11:40 p.m., 15 minutes from the end of her shift, she was passing this ICU on a transport run when she heard the voice through the partially open door of room 6. The overnight security had shifted. The federal plainclothes officer was gone, and the Navy security officer was posted outside in the corridor. The voice she heard from inside the room was rough with sedation and recent surgery, but the register was absolutely unmistakable once you'd heard it, Commander Room. She stopped in the corridor. Through the narrow gap of the partially open door, she could hear Cray talking to someone, the night nurse. Based on the rhythm of the exchange, soft questions being redirected gently back toward rest. But Cray was surfacing through the sedation with the stubborn, effortful determination of a man whose system had been trained to stay conscious under conditions designed to prevent it. There's a medic, he was saying. She was here. Last night. His voice caught on something. Nightjar. Someone needs to find her. Admiral, you really need to. Write it down. Nightjar. She's supposed to be dead. They told us she was gone 5 years ago, declared Kia. He stopped to breathe. But I know her voice. I know it. And if whoever's been coming after me figures out she's still alive and here, he stopped again. When he spoke, it was quieter, and somehow that was worse. They'll come for her next. She doesn't know what she walked into. Petra stood in the corridor for 4 seconds, exactly. Then she walked to the nursing station, completed her sign-out documentation, and clocked off her shift. She went to the parking structure. She sat in her car with the engine off and her hands flat on her thighs, and she breathed, counted, and deliberate until her pulse hit the number she needed it to be. 5 years. She had constructed this life across 5 years of careful, methodical work, a city far enough from her operational history to make coincidence statistically negligible, a professional identity built on visible limitation rather than capability, a social footprint narrow enough that no one would look twice. She had been so exhaustively careful that she had sometimes almost believed she was actually the person she had built. And in 18 hours, she had said a classified call sign in a room with 11 witnesses, independently cardioverted a post-surgical flag officer in front of a suspicious attending and a resident who was already compiling her inventory of inconsistencies, and been identified vocally, by name, by the man whose life she'd saved, loudly enough that anyone in the corridor could have heard it. She pulled out her phone. The contact she needed wasn't stored anywhere. She had kept it in memory only, a 7-digit sequence she had rehearsed regularly for 5 years, precisely because she hoped she would never need to use it. She dialed. 2 rings. This line is no longer active, a recorded message said. If you have reached this number in error, she ended the call. Inactive, which meant the handler was either rotated out, burned, or both. Which meant the emergency infrastructure she had mapped as a last resort had been restructured in the 5 years since she'd gone dark, and the version of it she was holding in her head no longer matched the version that existed. She sat in the car in the concrete dark of the parking structure and worked through the implications with the methodical, unfrightened clarity of someone who had learned that panic was a resource expenditure with a poor return. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. Text message. 6 words and a location marker. They know you're here. Leave now. She stared at the message. The timestamp showed it had been sent 9 minutes ago while she was still inside the hospital, still in the corridor outside room 6. Which meant whoever had sent it was either inside the hospital or had surveillance on the hospital, or was monitoring communications traffic that included the specific channels she had just inadvertently activated by using a classified designation in a room full of people. None of those options were comfortable. She looked at the location marker embedded in the message. A parking structure, not this one. A different one, 3 miles north, off a commercial corridor. The kind of location that provided cover and exit routes and enough ambient traffic that a parked car didn't generate interest. She thought about Cray's voice through that door. They'll come for her next. She thought about what it meant that the number she'd called was inactive, and what it meant that someone else had found her instead. She thought about what she had actually walked into when she'd opened her mouth last night. And she was honest with herself in the way she always tried to be when the situation was past the point where dishonesty was useful, about what her options looked like from the outside of this parking structure at 12:06 a.m. on a Wednesday in late October. Then she started the car, pulled out of the space, and drove north. Not because the message had convinced her, because Desmond Cray was 2 floors up in the ICU, with inadequate security for what he apparently knew, and someone who knew where she was had just told her they were coming, and the nurse with the shaky hands and the charting problems was already gone. What was left was something she'd been trying to bury for 5 years. It turned out burial had a time limit. The parking structure 3 miles north was a 6-story commercial concrete box attached to a shopping corridor that closed at 9. At 12:23 a.m., it held maybe 40 cars spread across 6 levels, which meant anyone moving through it had sight lines and cover in roughly equal measure. Petra drove to the 4th level before she stopped, not because the message had specified a level, but because 4 gave her a view of the entry ramp and enough ceiling above her that an approach from the roof was loud and slow. Old habits. She hadn't chosen them consciously. They chose themselves. She sat with the engine off for 6 minutes. Nobody came. At the 7-minute mark, headlights swept the ramp from below, and a dark sedan pulled onto the 4th level and parked 2 rows over and 4 spaces down. The driver's door opened. A woman got out, late 40s, short gray streaked hair, wearing a civilian jacket over what read as a collared shirt. She walked toward Petra's car without looking around, which was either confidence or deliberate performance of confidence, and Petra couldn't tell yet which one it was. The woman stopped outside the passenger window. Petra didn't unlock the door. "My name is Carver," the woman said, loud enough to carry through the glass. "I work with an office you've interacted with before, under a different arrangement. I'm not going to show you credentials through a window, because you'll know in 30 seconds whether I'm telling the truth." Petra unlocked the door. Carver got in, and the first thing she did was not speak. She sat with her hands in her lap and let Petra look at her for a moment, which was the right move. It communicated patience rather than urgency, and patience in this context meant confidence, and confidence meant she had something real to offer. Petra clocked the jacket, the posture, the hands, no visible hardware, no earpiece, no one waiting at the sedan. "You're not my original handler," Petra said. "No. Rollins retired 2 years ago. I picked up a subset of his legacy cases. He didn't inform me of a transition. He wasn't supposed to. The architecture was designed so that you wouldn't need to know unless something activated." Carver looked at her steadily. "Something activated. Tell me what you know." Carver turned slightly in the seat. "Admiral Desmond Cray has been the subject of a targeted elimination effort for approximately 6 weeks. 2 prior attempts, one staged as a traffic accident, one as a home invasion that was interrupted before completion. Tonight was the 3rd. The people behind it are organized, well-funded, and have significant intelligence access which is how they knew where he was tonight and how they were able to position a shooter on short notice. Who are they? We're still building that picture. She said it without apology, which Petra respected more than she would have respected false certainty. What we know is that Cray was running a private investigation off-book, no official authorization into the disappearance of 9 Navy personnel across the last 14 months. He believed their disappearances were connected. He believed someone inside the command structure was responsible. Petra was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car moved through the level below them, headlights tracking across the ceiling. And someone inside the hospital tonight. Yes. Who sent me the message? Carver's expression shifted slightly. Not guilt exactly, more the look of someone recalibrating how much they'd underestimated the person across from them. We had an asset on the hospital security rotation. He flagged you when the Admiral started talking. Petra thought about D. Castle's name tag. The former Army 11-year, 2-deployment face that had asked her questions she hadn't fully answered. Cassell, she said. Carver didn't confirm or deny it, which was its own confirmation. You need to understand what you walked into last night, Commander. The title landed in the car and sat there. Petra hadn't heard it applied to herself in 5 years. It felt like pressing on a bruise you'd forgotten. You had not sharp pain, but the particular ache of something that hadn't healed correctly. I'm a nurse, she said. My name is Petra Walsh. Your name is Commander Lydia Voss, Carver said quietly and without drama. Former Special Operations, Medical Officer, Tier 1 Attachment, declared killed in action in the Panjshir Valley 5 years and 4 months ago. Your file is still classified at a level that requires Deputy Director sign-off to access. She paused. And as of tonight, at least 2 people outside this vehicle know you're alive. One of them is in a hospital bed with inadequate security. The other one we haven't identified yet. The night outside the windshield was very still. Petra Lydia sat with that for a moment, feeling the name settle against her like something cold and exact. What do you need from me? She said finally. Right now? Nothing. Go home. Come back to your shift tomorrow. Don't deviate from your pattern. And Cray? We're working on improving his security posture. His current security posture is 1 Navy guard and a night nurse who doesn't know what she sits in 6 desks. She looked at Carver. That's not a posture. That's a gap. We're aware. If they tried 3 times in 6 weeks, the 4th attempt isn't going to wait for your office to improve its posture. She said it without heat, the way you state a tactical reality rather than score a point. What are the vectors? Medication line, food service, the HVAC system, if they have the right equipments. Commander Nurse Walsh, she said. And you haven't answered my question. Carver looked at her for a long moment. Go home, she said. I'll be in touch. Petra got out of the car and walked back to her own vehicle and drove home, and she didn't sleep, and in the morning she was back in the Calloway staff parking structure by 2:47 p.m., with 13 minutes to spare before her shift began. She lasted 6 hours before everything she'd been trying to hold at arm's length came apart. The day shift was quiet in the particular way that military medical centers are quiet when the staff is managing a combination of post-surgical recoveries and the ambient institutional tension that accumulates when something significant has happened, and not everyone has been told what it was. Burroughs was on, but occupied with a morning consultation that kept him away from the floor. Pryor was covering 2 cases. Petra ran her restricted duties with the precision of someone who had decided that precision was the only available form of control. She medicated. She transported. She documented. She did not go near the SICU. At 6:40 p.m., the overhead page fired for a code in the SICU. Room 6. She was moving before she had made a conscious decision to move, and she was aware of that, and she kept moving anyway. The corridor outside room 6 had 2 security officers, now the Navy Guard, and a second in plainclothes who was new since this morning, which meant Carver had delivered on at least one thing. Both of them were positioned facing into the room rather than down the corridor, which was the wrong orientation if your threat model included someone coming from inside the hospital rather than outside it. But she didn't have time to work through that problem right now. The room was in chaos. Cray was in respiratory arrest, post-surgical complication, the kind that happens when a patient who has been sedated begins fighting the vent without adequate warning. The vent alarm was going. His oxygen saturation was in free fall on the monitor. Dr. Ostrowski's resident, a third year named Marcus Fielding, was at the bedside looking at the vent settings with the particular expression of someone who has just realized the gap between knowing what should be done and knowing how to do it. "What's the vent doing?" Petra asked from the doorway. Fielding looked at her. "It's the PEEP settings. I think the auto PEEP is minus." "Is he breath stacking?" "I think." "Check the waveform." She was already in the room. "Look at the expiratory flow. Does it return to baseline before the next breath triggers?" Fielding looked at the screen. "No, it doesn't. He's stacking." "Disconnect the circuit for 5 seconds and let him exhale fully." "I'm not." "Or you can watch his saturation hit 60 and manage the code instead." She said it without cruelty, just with the flatness of someone describing a timeline. "Your call, Dr. Fielding. You're the physician." He disconnected the ventilator circuit. Cray's chest fell in a long, uneven exhale 5 seconds, 6, 7. When Fielding reconnected, the next waveform returned to baseline. The saturation number stopped falling and began to climb. 61, 68, 74. 90 seconds later, it crossed 90 and the room came back from the edge. Fielding adjusted the vent settings with slightly unsteady hands and didn't speak for a moment. "Where did he started?" "You'll want to document the auto PEEP event and flag Dr. Ostrowski," Petra said. "She'll want to know her post-op vented patients are developing dynamic hyperinflation." She left before he could finish the question. In the corridor, she walked past both security officers without making eye contact, and she was 10 steps toward the elevator when a hand closed on her arm, not aggressively, but with enough certainty to stop her. It was Cassell. He wasn't in his security uniform. He was in street clothes, which meant he was either off-duty or running something that required not being identifiable as hospital security. And neither option was particularly reassuring. "We have a problem," he said quietly. "Let go of my arm." He did immediately. The medication log for SICU room 6. Someone queried it from a terminal, the pharmacy's substation, at 4:15 this morning. Access credentials belong to a nurse who was on her scheduled day off and has confirmed she didn't come in. Petra kept her expression neutral. "You need to report that to your supervisor and the pharmacy director." "I already did. They're treating it as a credentialing error." He looked at her steadily. It wasn't a credentialing error. What was it? Someone was building a medication profile. Looking for windows what he's receiving, what the timing is, where a substitution or addition wouldn't flag on a standard review. He paused. That's not random. That's someone who knows exactly what they're looking for. She processed that. Who has access to the pharmacy substation terminal at 4:15 a.m.? Anyone with a level 2 credential and a reason to be in the building. He paused. Which is about 60 people on any given shift. She looked at him for a moment. "You're Carver's asset." He didn't blink. "I'm a hospital security officer with a concern about a patient." "That's not a denial." "No," he said, "it's not." He held her gaze. "Whatever you are, I've been in enough rooms to know I'm not the most qualified person in this conversation. So I'm going to tell you what I see and let you do what you do with it." It was, she thought, one of the more honest things anyone had said to her in 14 months. "Keep the log," she said. "Don't flag it again through official channels. If the inside access is as deep as you're suggesting, the official channels are part of the problem." She walked to the elevator. He let her go. She spent the remaining 3 hours of her shift doing her restricted duties and thinking about medication profiles and access windows and the specific question of who inside a military medical center would know enough to query a post-surgical. Admiral's medication log at 4:15 in the morning without triggering an immediate alert. The answer to that question had a shape. She didn't have enough information to fill it in yet, but she could feel its edges. At 9:45 p.m., she was documenting her last medication round when Dr. Burroughs appeared at the nursing station with the expression he reserved for situations he found professionally offensive. "My office," he said. "Now." His office was a glass-walled room off the main corridor that provided the illusion of privacy without actually delivering it. He closed the door. He sat down behind his desk, which he did when he wanted the desk to himself and the conversation. Dr. Fielding reported a clinical intervention in the SICU at approximately 6:45 this evening, he said. He indicated you identified and managed an auto-PPEEP event in Admiral Cray's ventilator management. I made a suggestion. Dr. Fielding made the clinical decision. That's a creative characterization. He set a folder on the desk her personnel file by the thickness of it. You're on restricted duties. No clinical decision-making. No procedures. I identified a ventilator complication to the attending physician. That's a clinical intervention, Walsh, and you know it. He opened the folder but didn't look at it. He looked at her. I've been doing this for 22 years. I know what skilled clinicians look like when they're performing and what they look like when they're actually thinking. He paused. You are not a nurse who got lucky twice. You're something else, and you've been hiding it in this department for over a year, and I want to know what it is. Petra sat with that for a moment. The fluorescent light above his desk had a slight flicker that she'd noticed the first time she'd been in this room and had been noticing ever since. I'm a nurse with a complicated prior history, she said. I prefer to keep them separate. That's not going to be sufficient anymore. I know. She looked at him. What's going to happen? I'm escalating the competency review to a formal investigation. Hospital administration will be involved. The credentialing board. He paused, and something in his expression shifted, slightly not softening exactly, but becoming more complicated. If you have documentation supporting your actual clinical background, now would be the time to introduce it. She didn't have documentation she could introduce. Not without the documentation raising questions that would require answers she couldn't give. I understand, she said. You're suspended effective immediately. Pending review, your access credentials are deactivated. He slid a form across the desk. Sign here, acknowledging receipt of the notification. She signed. Her hand was perfectly steady, which she suspected he noticed. She walked out of his office and down the corridor and handed her badge to the charge nurse and left the building. In the parking structure, she sat in her car and calculated how long she had before the suspension became visible to whoever was monitoring staff movement in the hospital. Whether that visibility would help her or hurt her depended entirely on who was doing the monitoring and what they wanted. Her phone rang. Unknown number, but not the same unknown number as before, different last 4 digits. She answered. You've been suspended. Carver's voice, flat and informational. We saw it at the credentialing system. 30 minutes ago. That complicates our timeline. What timeline? A pause. We identified the medication query. The credentials belonged to a nurse named Delia Faro. She's been at Calloway for 7 years. Clean record. No flags. Someone used her credentials or she was recruited. We're working that question. Another pause, shorter. There's something else. Cray regained full consciousness this afternoon for approximately 20 minutes before the sedation was reintroduced. He spoke to the attending nurse on duty. Carver's voice changed. Register slightly still professional, but with something careful underneath it. He said, your name, your actual name. Petra was very still. Not Walsh, she said, not Walsh. The name Cray had said was the name that was supposed to be on a casualty notification letter in a file that required deputy director clearance to open. The name attached to a record that officially ended in the Panjshir Valley 5 years and 4 months ago. Who heard it? The nurse. Potentially the security officer in the room they rotated at 40 p.m. So we're not certain which one was present. You need to identify every person who was in or near that room between 20 and 40 p.m. today. We're doing that. And the medication vector. If someone queried his medication profile at 4:15 a.m., they've already identified the window. She worked the math. The overnight nursing handoff is at 11:00 p.m. If they're going to move through the medication line, that's the transition period with the lowest verification density. Silence on the line for 2 seconds. That's in 73 minutes, Carver said. Yes, you've been suspended. You don't have building access. I know. Another pause. I can't officially authorize. You're not authorizing anything, Petra said. I'm a nurse who's concerned about a patient. She ended the call. She sat in the car for 45 seconds. Then she pulled out the hospital floor plan she had memorized in her second week at Calloway, not because she'd anticipated this moment specifically, but because she had a habit developed over years of operating in environments where exits were the most important architectural feature, of memorizing floor plans the way other people memorized phone numbers. The loading dock on the east side of the building had a badge reader that was currently flagged for maintenance on the facility management system. She'd seen the work order 2 weeks ago and noted it with the automatic, unconscious attention to detail that she had also never been able to train away. Badge readers, flagged for maintenance, often operated in a degraded mode that still logged entry but didn't trigger an access-denied response. She got out of the car. She moved through the parking structure toward the east side of the building, staying in the camera blind spot she had also. At some point in the last 14 months, cataloged without conscious intent. At the loading dock, she swiped her deactivated badge. The door clicked open. She was inside Calloway Military Medical Center at 10:09 p.m. with a suspended credential and 71 minutes before the nursing handoff. She took the service stairs to the 4th floor. The SICU corridor was quiet in the way hospital corridors are quiet. At this hour, not empty, but reduced. The ambient activity level dropping as the day staff finished their handoffs and the night's staff settled into the rhythms of overnight management. 2 security officers, outside room, 6 different faces from the afternoon rotation. A nursing station with 2 staff members visible, heads down over monitors. She needed to get inside that room without being stopped, and she needed to check the medication line, and she needed to do it before the 11:00 p.m. handoff created the confusion window she'd identified as the most likely insertion point. She was still working through the approach when the SICU doors opened from inside, and a figure in scrubs walked out unhurried, carrying a small medication tray, moving with the ordinary purposefulness of someone executing a routine task at the end of a shift. Petra looked at the tray. The tray held a single syringe and a medication label that, from 12 feet away in a corridor, lit for overnight operations, showed a name that was not the name of any medication she had seen on Cray's chart during her review of the board this afternoon. She looked at the figure's face. She didn't recognize her. Female, probably mid-30s, dark hair under a scrub cap, hospital ID badge clipped to her chest. But the way she held the tray slightly angled away from the security officers as she passed them. The body positioning that wasn't aggressive, but was deliberate, in a way that was too careful to be unconscious, that she recognized. The woman turned toward the corridor junction and the medication room. Petra moved. She came in from the side, not from behind. From behind triggered startle and noise. From the side at the same pace, merging into step alongside the way you fell in next to a colleague. "Hey," she said, keeping her voice low and even. "Can I check that label? I think there might be a crossover from the chart update this afternoon." The woman glanced at her, and in that glance, something happened a fraction of a second of assessment that was too fast and too complete. to be a nurse checking whether a colleague was authorized to look at a medication tray. "I've got it," the woman said. "It'll take 2 seconds." I said, "I've got it." She was already moving faster, the unhurried purposefulness tightening into something with an edge, and Petra kept pace and said, quietly enough that it didn't carry, "Put it down." The woman stopped. She turned. And the tray came up and around in a strike that was fast and precise and not remotely consistent with 7 years of clean record at Calloway Military Medical Center. And Petra caught the wrist behind it with both hands and redirected, and the syringe clattered to the floor. And the woman drove an elbow toward Petra's face that she ducked by a margin that was narrower than she would have preferred. The noise they were making was not large, but it was not nothing. And at the end of the corridor, the security officers had turned. One of them called. The woman made a decision. Petra could feel it in the instant of stillness before she made it, and went for the dropped syringe. Petra stepped on it. "Don't," she said. The woman looked up at her from the floor, and for a moment the calculation was visible in her face. Probability assessment, outcome mapping, the same kind of rapid tactical math that Petra herself was running. Then the security officers arrived, and the math resolved, and the woman put her hands flat on the floor. Petra straightened up. Her left arm was going to bruise from the elbow. She hadn't quite fully deflected. She could already feel it. "Call Cassell," she said to the security officers. "And nobody touches that syringe until someone from federal oversight has logged it." One of the officers was already on his radio. The other was looking at Petra with an expression that was somewhere between professional and bewildered. "Ma'am," he said, "you're the nurse that was suspended this evening." "Yes," she said. "You don't have building access." "Also, yes." She looked at the syringe on the floor, the medication label still legible from where she was standing. "I'd focus on that first." 40 seconds later, Cassell arrived at a pace that confirmed he'd been somewhere close already. And when he looked at the syringe, and then at Petra, and then at the woman on the floor, his face ran through a sequence of expressions that ended somewhere in the vicinity of someone who has just watched a theory proven correct in a way they're not entirely comfortable with. "Tell me she's not on staff here," Petra said quietly. "She is," Cassell said. 7 years. SICU rotation." He looked at the syringe. "We're going to need the lab for that." "Yes," Petra said. "And you're going to need to secure every medication access point to room 6 and run the full shift contact log from the last 48 hours. She paused. "And someone needs to tell Carver that the insertion attempt was tonight, not tomorrow." Cassell was already on his phone. Down the corridor, through the SICU door, Desmond Cray was alive. For the moment, and by the narrowest of margins, he was still alive, and whoever had sent a woman with a syringe and 7 years of clean record to change that had failed. That was the only ledger entry that mattered right now. But Petra stood in the corridor with her bruised arm, and her deactivated badge, and her suspended credentials, and she was aware with absolute clarity that the woman on the floor was not the top of this. She was a tool recruited or coerced, highly trained, positioned inside the hospital long before tonight, which meant someone with significant intelligence access and significant patience had planned this carefully, and the plan had not originated with a nurse on a SICU rotation. The plan had originated somewhere much higher. She was still turning that over when Cassell came back and said quietly, "The syringe. Lab's running preliminary identification now." He paused. "It's not a medication that's on any formulary at this hospital." She looked at him. "Whoever manufactured it," he said, "had access to a synthesis process that isn't commercially available." He held her gaze. "We're not dealing with a contract hit. This is a state-level asset." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere behind her, footsteps, multiple sets, moving fast from the direction of the main elevators. She turned. 3 men in dark suits, federal identification already in hand, moving with the coordinated purpose of people who had been waiting for a specific trigger before they could move. Behind them, a 4th figure in military uniform navy, flag rank insignia whose face Petra didn't recognize. The lead suit looked at Cassell. "Where is she?" Cassell pointed at Petra. The suit turned to her. "Commander Voss, we need to speak with you." She heard her actual name in the open air of a hospital corridor, said plainly by a federal officer in front of 2 security guards and a woman still sitting on the floor with her hands out. 5 years of careful burial gone in 36 hours. She looked at the suit. "I need to see identification," she said. "All of you." The suit produced it. The other 2 followed. She read each one carefully, taking her time. Not because she needed the time, but because she was establishing from this first moment the terms of the conversation. She was not someone who could be rushed or managed or maneuvered by the weight of institutional authority. She handed the last ID back. "All right," she said. "Talk." The lead suit's name was Garrett Hollis, and he had the kind of face that had spent years learning not to show what it was thinking, which made it easier to read. Rather than harder, the effort of concealment was itself information. He was mid-50s, DoD civilian intelligence, and the way he looked at Petra when he said her actual name in that corridor told her 2 things simultaneously. He was relieved she was alive, and he was not entirely sure what to do with her, now that she was. The Navy flag officer behind him was a 2-star Rear Admiral named Curtis Payne, whom Petra didn't know personally, but whose name she recognized from operational briefings that were now 5 years old. Payne had been a 1-star when she'd last seen his name on a document. He'd apparently continued his career in her absence. They used a conference room on the 2nd floor, one of the administrative ones, not a clinical space, with a long table and chairs and a whiteboard still covered in supply chain notes from someone's afternoon meeting. Hollis's 2 colleagues stationed themselves outside the door. Cassell came in and stood near the wall. Petra sat at the table and did not ask for water or coffee or anything that would make this feel like a conversation she was settling into. "How much do you know?" Hollis said. "Tell me what you came to tell me," she said. "I'll fill the gaps." Hollis looked at Payne, who gave a small nod that meant something specific between them, and then Hollis opened a folder and set it on the table and turned it toward her. The folder contained photographs. Surveillance quality, some of them long lens, low light, the kind of images that cost significant resources to collect. 9 faces, 9 names. Navy personnel, ranks ranging from EC6 to 04, all of them photographed in what appeared to be some kind of institutional setting that was not any military facility Petra recognized. "These are the 9 personnel Admiral Cray was investigating," Hollis said. "Officially listed as AWOL, medically separated, or deceased across a 14-month window." She looked at the photographs. "They're being held somewhere." "We believe so. We haven't identified the location." "Cray knew more than 9, she said. "He said something in the SICU. I heard it. He used the word 9 in one breath and said something about a larger number. I couldn't catch all of it." Hollis and Payne exchanged another look. His original investigation flagged. 11, Payne said. 2 of them we can account for. 1 is genuinely deceased. 1 we located in a VA facility under a different admission. The remaining 9 are unaccounted for. What did they have in common? All of them had access to a classified program designation we're not going to name in this room, Hollis said. All of them either requested transfer out of the program or raised internal concerns about its operation. All of them disappeared within a 60-day window of making those concerns known. She looked at the photographs again. The faces were ordinary in the way that military faces were ordinary, a range of ages and backgrounds. People who had signed up for something and found themselves holding information someone else needed to suppress. Who runs the program? Hollis closed the folder. That's what we need Cray to tell us. He compiled evidence documentation, recordings, financial records. He hid it before he was shot. He hasn't been stable enough to tell us where. He's been stable enough to talk, Petra said. He's been surfacing through sedation repeatedly. He hasn't told his security detail. He doesn't trust his security detail. She said it plainly. He called out for me twice. Both times, he had information he was trying to communicate, and both times, the people in the room weren't the people he'd chosen to communicate it to. Hollis looked at her for a moment. Would he talk to you? I don't know, but I know he won't talk to you. She looked at Payne. Or to anyone in that uniform right now. Not until he knows who's clean. Payne's jaw tightened slightly. I've known Desmond Cray for 20 years, and he still hasn't told his security detail where the evidence is. She held his gaze. That's not a comment on you personally, Admiral. That's Cray making a risk calculation, and his risk calculation has kept him alive through 3 assassination attempts. A pause. What do you need? Hollis said. Reinstatement of my building access. Temporary, limited to the SICU. And I need the 2 security officers outside his room replaced with people from outside this facility's regular rotation. People Cray's handler hasn't had contact with for at least 18 months. That's going to take. And I need the name of whoever authorized Delia Faro's hiring at this facility 7 years ago, she said. Because the syringe she was carrying tonight was not something you acquire through a network. Someone with program access recruited her and positioned her here, and they did it years ago, which means this wasn't a reactive operation. This was a contingency. The room was very quiet. They planned for him becoming a problem, Cassell said from the wall. It was the first thing he'd said since they'd sat down. They planned for anyone becoming a problem, Petra said. Cray was the contingency that activated. Someone else might have been the original target. Hollis was already on his phone. Her building access was reinstated at 12:40 Temporary, flagged as consultant status, logged under a designator that would look like a standard credentialing override to anyone checking the system. The 2 security officers outside room 6 were replaced by 10A, with personnel who arrived in plainclothes and did not introduce themselves. Petra went into the room alone. Cray was awake. Not the fighting through sedation kind of awake from before, but actually awake, eyes clear, tracking the particular stillness of someone who had been waiting and had decided to keep waiting until the right moment. His color was better than it had been 2 nights ago, which meant Ostrowski's team had done their work well. He still looked like a man who had been shot twice and operated on for 4 hours, and there was no version of that which looked anything other than what it was. He looked at her when she came through the door, and something in his face thought shifted, not surprise. Could something that was difficult to her, but something that was difficult to name, and that she chose not to look at too directly. They told me you were dead, he said. His voice was rough but steady. I know, Panshir. They gave us a full briefing. Casualty notification, the works. He paused. I didn't believe it. I should have. I had no reason not to. But I didn't. Admiral Desmond, he said. We're past rank. She sat down in the chair beside his bed. Tell me where the evidence is. He looked at her for a moment. Just like that. We don't have time for the other version of this conversation. Something that wasn't quite a smile crossed his face. No. Suppose we don't. He shifted against the pillow, which cost him, and she watched him manage the cost without comment because he wouldn't want the comment. There's a property in Caldwell County. 40 minutes south of here, off Route 9, down an unmarked access road. The property is registered to a name that doesn't connect back to me through any searchable record. He paused. In the main structure, there's a floor safe under the kitchen. Combination is the date of the Kandahar extraction, written in Julian format. She knew the date. She had been there. What's in it? Recordings. 18 months of intercepted communications. I had help from someone inside the signals intelligence structure who's now also gone quiet. Financial records showing black budget allocations that don't correspond to any authorized program. And a document. He stopped. A transfer manifest. Names, dates, locations. 9 personnel moved through a facility in 3 separate batches. The manifest has a signature block. Whose signature? He looked at her steadily. Someone you'd recognize. Tell me. When you have the document in your hands, he said. Not before. Because if I tell you now and something happens to you before you reach that property, I've handed them everything they need to know about what I've compiled. She understood the logic. She didn't like it, but she understood it. I'm going to need Cassell and at least one of Hollis's people. Take whoever you need, but go fast. His eyes were serious and tired in equal measure. They know I'm alive. They know I've been talking. Every hour you're not at that property is an hour they have to reach it first. She stood up. We'll get it, Lydia. He used her name, her actual name quietly, without ceremony. Whatever they told you about Panshir. What actually happened? I'd like to know when this is over. She looked at him. When this is over, she said. She left the room. She briefed Hollis and Cassell in the corridor in under 4 minutes, which was all the time the situation allowed. Hollis wanted to run a full advance team to the property. Petra told him that a full advance team on a rural access road at 130A. M was visible for 20 minutes in any direction to anyone with a scanner, and that if the opposition had the kind of signals intelligence access that the Faro operation suggested, they'd burn the property before the advance team found the front door. 3 people, she said. Fast, quiet, in and out. We get the safe contents, we bring them here, and then you can run your full operation. Hollis didn't like it. He agreed to it because the alternative was worse, and he was smart enough to know it. Castle drove. Hollis sent one of his people a woman named Trent, which was either a last name or a first name, and she didn't offer clarification who drove separately, and said fewer than 10 words during the entire operation, which Petra appreciated. The property was exactly what Cray had described, a low structure on a cleared lot, surrounded by enough trees to make the access road invisible from the route. No lights, no visible security. The kind of place that looked abandoned from the outside and was designed to. Cassell cleared the perimeter. Trent held the access road. Petra went in through the front door, which was unlocked, which was either good operational security through simplicity or a problem she hadn't accounted for. The kitchen floor safe was under a section of linoleum that had been laid over it and could be lifted at one corner. The combination opened on the first attempt. The safe contained a fireproof document sleeve, 2 encrypted drives, and a small digital recorder. She was reaching for the document sleeve when she heard the vehicle. Not on the access road from the north, a direction that didn't have a road on the property map she'd looked at during the drive down, which meant either the map was wrong or someone had come across the adjacent property on foot and brought a vehicle to the tree line. She had the document sleeve and both drives, and was out the back door in 11 seconds, which was not her best time, but was adequate, given that she was barefoot. She'd left her shoes at the safe because the linoleum had made noise, and the backyard was uneven ground in the dark. She heard Castle's voice from the front of the property, short, clipped, the tone of someone who had registered incoming and was repositioning. Then a sound she recognized without needing to think about it, the suppressed crack of a precision rifle and the impact sound of it finding something solid. She ran the perimeter toward Trent's position at the access road. Trent was behind her vehicle with her sidearm drawn, phone pressed to her ear. We have multiple incoming from the north tree line, she said when she saw Petra. Cassell I heard him. Is he down? I don't know. Petra handed her the drives. These go with you. Don't stop. She kept the document sleeve. Go. I'm not leaving. You're leaving because those drives are the evidence, and you're the one with a vehicle and a radio that works out here. Go. Trent went. Petra moved back toward the house. Cassell was at the northeast corner, upright, which was the first good thing the rifle shot had taken out the vehicle he'd been standing near, not him. He had his sidearm in a 2-handed grip and was tracking movement at the tree line 60 meters out, where shapes were resolving out of the darkness with the deliberate patience of people who had done this before. "How many?" she said, coming up beside him. "I counted 4. There might be 5. She looked at the tree line. 4 figures moving in a spread pattern, maintaining distance, not rushing, which meant they weren't there to grab the evidence and run. They were there to eliminate. The evidence was secondary. The witnesses were the objective. "We can't engage at this ratio," she said. "I know. Options?" She looked at the property. The house had a basement access. She'd registered it when she swept the interior, a hatch door near the kitchen that opened onto a concrete foundation space. Not cover exactly, but concealment, and concealment bought time, and time was what they needed Trent to use. "Inside," she said, "basement access. We hold the choke point. That's a defended corner, not an exit. It doesn't need to be an exit. It needs to be 12 minutes. He looked at her. "How sure are you about 12 minutes? "I told Hollis where we were going. He's not going to wait the full briefing window before he sends backup." Cassell considered this for approximately 1 second. "Inside," he said. They went in through the back door. Petra first. The figures at the tree line had seen the movement. She registered the shift in their positioning, the tightening of the spread, and they were accelerating. Now, the patient's giving way to operational necessity. The house gave her, and Cassell maybe 90 seconds before the first entry point was tested. The basement hatch was a heavy wooden door set into the floor, opening onto a concrete stairwell. She got it open. Cassell went down. First, she needed to be last because she needed to hold the upper position for the first contact, and she pulled the hatch partially closed above her and positioned herself on the top 3 stairs with a clear line to the back door. The first figure came through the kitchen window instead of the door. That was professionally competent, and she adjusted for it, and the adjustment was not clean. The stairwell was narrow and the angle was wrong, and what she managed was a redirected momentum rather than a controlled takedown, and she lost 2 stairs worth of footing in the process and caught herself on the wall with her shoulder hard. Cassell was immediately behind her. Cassell in the kitchen registered 2 opponents in a confined space and made the correct professional decision to disengage and reposition rather than force the close quarters engagement. And for approximately 20 seconds, there was a standoff. Then a second figure appeared at the back door. Then the third at the kitchen window. "Walsh," Cassell said, very quietly, using the name she'd been using at Calloway rather than the name that had come out in the corridor, and she registered that as a specific and considered courtesy. "Talk to me. We hold the bottom of the stairs," she said. "Single file approach. Bad odds for them. They can't throw fire in here without risking the documents, and they know the documents are why they're here. That assumes they know you have the documents on you. They don't know. I don't." A voice from the kitchen, flat and without effect. "We have your egress covered. Come up." Hands visible. Neither Petra nor Cassell said anything. "The documents," the voice said, "give them up, and this ends. You sent someone to a hospital to put a synthetic compound into a post-surgical Admiral's IV line," Cassell said. "This doesn't end." Silence from the kitchen. Then, from outside, at a distance that was decreasing, engines. Not one. Multiple, the pattern of a convoy moving fast on the access road, which was the sound of Hollis having done the math and moved sooner than 12 minutes. The figures in the kitchen registered it too. There was a brief, dense silence, the kind that exists while a tactical calculation is being revised, and then the sounds of movement and the back door, and then nothing from the kitchen but the settling of a house at night. Cassell exhaled. "They're going. They'll be gone before Hollis's people are through the tree line," she said. "Tell them north. Tell them to look for vehicle tracks in the north property line." He was already on the phone. She came up the stairs and stood in the kitchen and looked at what the last 4 minutes had left behind. An overturned chair, a broken window, a floor safe, standing open, with the linoleum peeled back beside it. Her shoulder was going to be significantly worse in the morning. Her feet were cut from the backyard. She was still holding the document sleeve. Hollis arrived with 8 people and established a perimeter that was professionally executed, and about 7 minutes too late to intercept anyone, which was exactly what she'd predicted and what she didn't say out loud, because saying it served nothing. She handed him the document sleeve and told him about the drives with Trent. He confirmed Trent had reached the rendezvous. He looked at the document sleeve with the expression of someone who had been running a very complex and very dangerous operation and has just been handed something that either confirms everything or destroys it. "Do you want to open it?" she said. "I want a chain of custody record first." She waited while that was established. Cassell photographed the sealed sleeve. Hollis signed the log. Petra initialed it under the consultant designator she'd been given 2 hours ago. Then Hollis opened the sleeve. The transfer manifest was the third document in the stack after 2 pages of financial records that meant specific things to people who knew how to read black budget allocations, and after a photograph that she didn't look at closely because it wasn't hers to look at yet. The manifest was 4 pages, single-spaced, formatted with the specific bureaucratic precision of official military documentation. 9 names, 3 transfer dates, a facility identifier that she didn't recognize, and a signature block at the bottom of the 4th page. She was standing at the right angle to read it when Hollis turned the page, and she read it. And she understood what Cray had meant when he'd said it was someone she'd recognize. She recognized the name, not from personal contact. From briefings, from the kind of operational briefings that involved reading the full command hierarchy of a theater, so that you knew exactly whose authority you were operating under at any given link in the chain. The name on the signature block belonged to a man who had, at the time of her last operational briefing, held a rank below the one he apparently held now. A Vice Admiral, the deputy operational commander of the entire Atlantic Naval Theater. She looked at Hollis. His face had gone very still in the way that faces go still when the information in front of them is simultaneously exactly what was suspected and far worse than anyone had been prepared for. "You know him," she said. "Yes." His voice was flat. "Everyone knows him. Then you know what it means that his signature is on a transfer manifest for 9 illegally detained service members. I know what it means. And you know that every operational channel you use to act on this information passes through a command structure he partially controls." Hollis set the manifest down on the kitchen counter carefully. He looked at it for a moment. "We're going to need to handle this outside normal channels," he said. "What does that mean in practice?" "It means that what I do next doesn't go through DoD liaison. It goes through an office that reports directly above it." He paused. "It means I need to make a call right now that I can't unmake." She looked at him. "Make it." He stepped outside to make the call. Castle appeared beside her. He looked at the manifest on the counter, then at her. "The signature block," he said. "Yes. That's..." He was quiet for a moment. "How high does this go?" "I don't know yet." She looked at the document. "High enough that someone spent 7 years positioning an asset inside a military medical center as a contingency. High enough that 3 assassination attempts on a flag officer didn't generate an internal investigation that caught anything." She paused. "High enough that they had access to a non-formulary synthesis compound for the 4th attempt. That's a significant infrastructure. It is." She looked out the broken kitchen window into the dark of the backyard. "And it's an infrastructure that now knows we have the manifest." He absorbed that. "Timeline. Short," she said. "However they built the inside access at Calloway Faro was one person, but Faro was probably not the only person. And if the man whose name is on that manifest decides that the evidence is recoverable, if Cray doesn't survive long enough to testify to its authenticity." She stopped. She looked at Cassell. Something had just clicked into place that she should have seen an hour ago, and the fact that she hadn't seen it until now was a problem that she could be angry at herself about later. "Hollis's people at the hospital," she said. How many of them came from outside the regular DoD liaison rotation? Cassell's expression changed. He said, "How many of them did you personally verify?" A pause. 2 seconds, which was long. "The two outside this ICU," he said. "I didn't verify them independently. Hollis told me they were cleared." And Hollis is currently outside making a call on a phone to an office that operates above DoD liaison. She was already moving toward the door, which means for the last 40 minutes, his regular DoD contacts have been watching him go off channel. If there's penetration at the DoD liaison level minus, then the two people outside Cray's room right now are not assets. She was already through the door. The drive back to Calloway was 38 minutes at the speed Cassell drove it. She spent the drive on the phone with the overnight charge nurse in this ICU, not asking about Cray, directly asking about staffing, about whether the overnight security rotation had remained consistent, listening for anything in the pauses between the nurse's answers that suggested something wrong. The charge nurse said everything was quiet. That was not the same as everything being fine. They were 7 minutes out when her phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she didn't have stored. She answered, heavy breathing. Was a voice she recognized, one of the two officers she'd seen posted outside room 6 when she left. "He's gone," the man said. His voice was wrong in a specific way. "The Admiral someone triggered a fire suppression discharge in the adjacent room, and we lost visual for—" He stopped. "The room is empty. He's not here." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Lock down the floor," she said. "Nobody in or out. And get Hollis on the line. Tell him the hospital." She ended the call. "How far?" she said to Cassell. 6 minutes. 4. She said. He drove 4. They came through the Calloway loading dock entrance at a run, and she took the stairs because the elevator was a controlled choke point, and she was on the 4th floor in 2 minutes with her shoulder screaming from the stairwell impact earlier and her cut feet leaving faint marks on the linoleum. The SICU corridor was wrong before she turned the corner. The energy of it, the sound, the specific quality of institutional chaos that had a center point somewhere ahead of her. She turned the corner. The door to room 6 was open. The two officers she'd left there were at the nursing station, one of them with his radio out, and their posture told her immediately they were not the problem, they were reacting to the problem, which meant they were either genuinely us Hollis's people, or they were very good at performing the correct response to a situation they'd engineered. She went into room 6. The bed was empty. The monitors were still running, still displaying waveforms from leads that were no longer attached to anyone, which meant the detachment had happened. In the waveforms hadn't flatlined yet. The IV line was on the floor, pulled rather than disconnected cleanly. The window was intact. She stood in the center of the room and looked at what was there. On the pillow, a small piece of paper, a handwritten note in the compact, precise handwriting of someone who had spent years writing in conditions that didn't allow for large movements. "North stairwell. Come alone, decap." She read it twice. Then she looked at the two officers in the doorway. "Which of you came on duty at 1:00 a.m., she said. The taller one raised his hand slightly. "Both of us." "Hollis's rotation." "Who authorized your rotation?" He gave her the name. She didn't recognize it, which meant it was either legitimate and she was outside the relevant chain, or it was constructed and she was outside the relevant chain. The outcome was the same. She had no way to verify these two men in the next 30 seconds, and the note said alone, and Cray had survived this long on instincts she had no reason to override. "Seal the floor," she said. "Nobody in or out. If Hollis calls, tell him I'm doing an internal sweep." She went to the north stairwell. It was empty at the 4th floor landing and at the 3rd floor landing, and she found him at the 2nd floor, sitting on the stairs with his IV site wrapped in a torn strip of his hospital gown, his color bad and his breathing worse than it should have been for a man who had made it this far under his own power. He had a small tablet device in his hands that he hadn't had in the SICU, which meant someone had brought it to him Or he'd had it hidden somewhere in that room that the security sweep had missed. He looked up at her. "There's a camera feed," he said. His voice was rough with effort. "On this device. Active right now." He turned the screen toward her. She looked at it. The feed was low resolution, but clear enough. A room she didn't recognize, not a hospital room, not a clinical space. Institutional, with concrete walls and controlled lighting, and the particular sterility of a base that had been designed for containment. In the room, 9 people. 9 people who matched 9 faces from the photographs in Hollis's folder. "They're alive," she said. "As of 6 hours ago," Cray said. "The feed updates on a 4-hour cycle. I had this tablet routed through 3 proxies, and I've been monitoring it for 11 days. He looked at her. "I moved myself because the 2 men Hollis put outside my door are not Hollis's people. I recognized the taller one. He was in a photograph I pulled from the signals intelligence data 3 months ago, attending a meeting he had no authorized reason to attend." She looked at him. "The man whose name is on the manifest," Cray said. "He knew about this operation before I made my first call to Hollis. He knew before I was shot." He stopped, breathing through the effort of the sentence. "Hollis isn't compromised, but someone in Hollis's office is, and that someone told the man on the manifest that we have the documents." She was already thinking through what that meant and what the next hour required. "Can you walk?" she said. "I've been walking. I need you in a secure location that isn't this building," she said. "And I need that feed preserved and transmitted to an address outside the DoD communication infrastructure." She looked at him. "Do you have that?" He looked at her for a moment. Outside through the stairwell walls, she could hear the muffled sounds of the 4th floor lockdown being established. Somewhere above them, Cassell was trying to reach her on a phone she'd silenced. "There's one more thing," Cray said. "Tell me, the facility on that feed." He looked at the screen. "I identified the location 6 days ago. I've been waiting until I had everything in place before I acted on it." He paused. "It's not a foreign site. It's not a black site in the traditional sense." He held the screen toward her. She looked at the feed again, at the background details she hadn't focused on before, at the institutional markings on the wall behind the 9 detained personnel, partially obscured but not fully. She read what was there. The facility was on American soil. The markings on the wall were American military designators. The people who had been illegally detained moved in batches, held in a room with concrete walls and controlled lighting. They were being held inside an active United States military installation. An installation that fell under the Atlantic Command Structure, under the authority of the man whose name was on the manifest. She stood in the stairwell with that for 3 seconds. Then from above them, from the 4th floor, from the direction of the SCE SciCU came the sound of something that was not a fire protection charge, and not a medical emergency, and not any of the sounds that belonged in a hospital at 2:40 in the morning. It was the sound of a door being breached. The sound of a breached door in a hospital at 2:40 in the morning had a specific quality that separated it from everything else a building made at night. It carried intention in a way that structural sounds didn't. A purposefulness that registered in the body before the mind finished processing it. Petra registered it and moved in the same moment. "Up," she said to Cray. "Now. I've been shot twice, I know. Up anyway." She got under his left arm and took his weight on her right side, which put pressure on the shoulder she'd hit in the Caldwell County basement and produced a very specific and unhelpful amount of pain that she filed and ignored. He was heavier than his hospital bed version had suggested, which meant the muscle mass was still there under the blood loss and the post-surgical pallor, and he found his footing faster than she'd expected. They went down, not up. Up toward the 4th floor was toward whatever had just come through that door, and down was toward the loading dock exit she'd used twice tonight and knew was still in maintenance-degraded mode. The stairwell was concrete and sound carried in it, And what she heard from above was not a single set of footsteps, but multiple controlled, spaced, the movement pattern of people who had trained for building clearance. Not hospital security. Not Hollis's people responding to the lockdown. Something else. Second floor landing. She pushed through into the corridor, checked it clear, and moved Cray into a supply alcove 6 steps from the stairwell door. She needed 30 seconds, and she needed him stationary. The tablet, she said. The feed. Send it to Hollis's direct line, not the office number, his personal. Do you have it? I have it. Do it now. And send the Caldwell County manifest photographs. Do you have those? He looked at her. You photographed the manifest before you handed it to Hollis. Yes. You didn't trust him. I trusted him. I photographed it anyway. She looked at the stairwell door. Send everything you have to his personal line with a location pin for this building. Then I need you to call a number I'm going to give you and stay on the line until someone answers. She gave him the number, not Carver's defunct line, but a secondary contact she'd kept in memory for exactly the kind of situation where primary contacts had become unreliable. A number she'd built herself, routed through a structure that predated her extraction, and had nothing to do with any handler, any program, any office that could be penetrated from the DODD liaison level. An old colleague. Someone who had been out of the field for 3 years and was working something administrative in a building she wasn't supposed to know about, which she knew about because he'd made it her business to know about during the period immediately. Before she went dark, when she was still building contingencies she hoped she'd never need. Tell them Nightjar is active, and the site is Calloway Medical, she said. Tell them I need external verification of building security, and tell them the Vice Admiral's name. They'll know what to do with it. Cray looked at the tablet, then at her. You've been running contingencies inside your contingencies. Old habit. She checked the corridor again. Stay here. Don't move until you hear from me or until the person on that number tells you to move. Where are you going? To find out how many people came through that door. She went back into the stairwell before he could argue. She went up fast and quiet, staying on the outside edge of the stairs, where the structural support was heaviest and the flex in the steps was minimal. Third floor, nothing. Fourth floor, landing the door to the SICU corridor, had been propped open with a fire extinguisher, which was both practically useful for rapid movement and specifically against the building's fire safety protocols. And the combination told her that whoever had come through that door hadn't expected to be in the building long. She stayed low on the landing side of the prop door and looked through the gap. The SICU corridor had 3 of them visible dark clothing, no markings, moving in the practiced way of people who had done building clearance enough times that it had become economical rather than tense. A 4th was coming out of a room at the far end of the corridor. No long weapons visible, which meant they were prioritizing concealment over firepower, which meant they were still operating under some expectation of plausible cover. The 2 officers Hollis had assigned were not visible. She didn't know if that was because they were in a room or because they were down, and she couldn't determine that from this position. She needed a different angle. She let the stairwell door close silently and went to the 3rd floor, then through the 3rd floor corridor to the East Wing stairwell, which connected to the SICU level through a maintenance access that most of the hospital staff didn't know about because it was marked as a utility passage and the signage discouraged foot traffic. She'd found it in her 2nd week, which was when she'd been cataloging exits. The maintenance access brought her out behind the SICU nursing station on the far side from where the 3 visible figures had been working. The nursing was empty, monitors are still running, the overnight staff not present, which meant they'd either been moved or had responded to the 4th floor lockdown alarm and been redirected. She looked around the nursing station. The crash cart was still in position. The medication dispensing cabinet was locked. The monitor bank was showing every room's vitals, and room 6 was showing flat lines on all leads, not because the patient had coded, but because the leads were off a now empty bed, and the systems hadn't been reset. She took a suture kit from the supply drawer because the cuts on her feet were starting to affect her footing, and she didn't have time for a proper repair, but she could do a field approximation in 40 seconds. And she did, biting off the excess suture with her teeth, because there was no scissors within reach, and she wasn't going to spend time looking. Then she heard the voice, coming from room 4, a room 2 doors down from Cray's former location. A room that had held a different patient earlier in the evening and was now apparently occupied by someone new. The voice was low and careful, the tone of someone giving instructions rather than receiving them. She moved to the door. Through the narrow gap at the hinge side, she could see part of the room. One of the figures in dark clothing, a phone pressed to his ear. He was facing the window, which gave her his back. She heard enough. Not in the room. We swept it twice. Either he moved under his own power, or someone moved him before we got here. The nurse is also not on the floor. A pause while he listened. Yes, the manifest is confirmed retrieved. Hollis's team has the drives. The question is whether the authentication. Another pause, longer. Understood. If it goes to the oversight office, the window closes. He stopped. His posture changed the particular stillness of someone who has just received information that requires rapid reassessment. What do you mean he's already called it in? His voice had gone tight. Which office? She didn't need to hear the rest of that sentence to understand what it meant. The number she'd given Cray had connected, and whatever her old colleague had set in motion from the other end had moved fast enough to register in the communications traffic that this man was monitoring. She was out of time for passive collection. She went into the room. It was not a clean entry. She didn't have the angle or the equipment for clean. And she'd stopped pretending at clean sometime around the Caldwell County basement. She came in fast and low and hit him from the left side before he'd fully turned, and the phone went one direction, and he went another. And what followed was 30 seconds of close quarters work that left him against the floor with his arm in a position that would require medical attention, and her knee on the back of his shoulder, and his phone 2 feet away, showing an active. Call to a number she photographed before she ended it. Who answered? She said. He said nothing. The call you were on. Who authorized tonight's operation? Still nothing. His breathing was controlled, which meant he was trained past the point where pain was a useful lever. She already knew that and didn't pursue it. She zip-tied his hands with the suture roll because she didn't have zip ties. And suture roll was what she had. And she left him in the room and took his phone and went back to the stairwell. On the second floor, Cray was where she'd left him. His color was worse. He had the tablet in his hands, and the call was still active, and when she appeared in the alcove doorway, he looked at her with the expression of someone who has been waiting and has spent the waiting time thinking about worst-case scenarios. Your contact answered, he said. They said 17 minutes. She looked at the phone she'd taken, at the number she'd photographed. She ran it against the numbers she had stored in memory from her operational years, the habit of memorizing significant contact information as an alternative to written records, and it matched something that placed it. In a command communications network she recognized. It was an internal number. Atlantic Theater Command Structure. Did Hollis's personal line connect? She said. Sent. He acknowledged receipt. Cray paused. He said he's moving. What does that mean? He said to tell you he's calling in a marker that's going to make the next hour very loud and that you should get the Admiral out of the building before it gets loud. She thought about that. He has something independent. Something outside the DoD liaison chain. Apparently. Congressional oversight, she said. It wasn't a question. It was the only structure that sat above the DoD liaison architecture, and below the office, Hollis had said he was going to call. He went to the oversight committee directly. Cray looked at her. That's a significant escalation. The man on that manifest commands a theater. There's no non-significant escalation. She pocketed the phone. Can you make it to the loading dock? I made it to the second floor on my own. The loading dock is 1 floor down and 200 meters of corridor. I know where the loading dock is, he said. I've been in this building for 3 days. She took his left arm over her shoulders again, and they moved. Castle met them at the loading dock with a vehicle he hadn't arrived in, which meant he'd acquired it in the last 20 minutes from somewhere within the hospital's facilities, which she chose not to examine too closely. His face, when he saw Cray upright and mobile, cycled through approximately 4 expressions in 2 seconds. The north stairwell breach, she said. 4 that I confirmed, possibly 5. 1 is restrained in room 4, SICU level. The others. 2 of them are in the lobby, he said. Hospital security has them. The 3rd I don't know about yet. He looked at Cray. Sir, we need to get you. I know, Cray said. Move. They got him into the vehicle. Castle drove. Petra kept Cray's IV site covered with her hand because the makeshift dressing he'd applied was failing, and blood loss on top of everything else was a problem she couldn't afford. He was watching the tablet with the other hand, the feed from the detention facility still cycling, the 9 faces still visible in the institutional light of a room on an American military installation. 17 minutes was your contact's estimate, Cray said. We're at 11. What happens at 17? He looked at her. Your contact didn't say, specifically. They said it would become apparent. She looked out the window. Cassell was running a route that kept them within a 2-block radius of the hospital, not fleeing the area, but holding a position that maintained proximity. That was either strategic or instinctive on his part, and she thought it was probably both. At the 13-minute mark, her phone buzzed. Hollis. Where are you? He said, mobile. Secure. The Oversight Committee chair was reached 40 minutes ago. She has been activated is the word I'd use. A pause. 3 federal marshals are currently at the home residence of Vice Admiral Warren Aldis. He's being transported to a federal facility for questioning. The name on the manifest, spoken out loud for the first time in her hearing. Warren Aldis. She turned it over, in her mind, the briefings that had included his name, the rank he'd held then versus the rank he held now, the trajectory of a career that had apparently been running 2 parallel tracks for an unknown number of years. The detention facility, she said. The location on the feed minus... We have it. A rescue team is being coordinated through a channel that doesn't touch Aldis's command structure. The facility's installation commander has been contacted by the Oversight Committee directly and has been advised that any interference with the rescue operation will result in immediate criminal referral. Another pause, shorter. He's cooperating. How quickly? The team is wheels up in 40 minutes. Estimated on site in 2 hours 20. Less than 3 hours. She looked at the tablet in Cray's hands, at the 9 faces in the cycling feed. The penetration in your office, she said. Aldis's contact inside your team. Identified, Hollis said, and the flatness in his voice when he said it told her the identification had been recent and was still sitting badly. An analyst who's been in my office for 4 years. She flagged our off-channel communication to Aldis's network within 20 minutes of my first call. Is she contained as of 20 minutes ago? The 2 officers at the SICU. The ones Cray identified as compromised. Hospital security has them in the lobby. I'm told there was some resistance. A pause. Minor. She exhaled. Not relief. Relief was premature and she knew it. But the shape of the situation was becoming clearer, and clarity, even in a bad situation, was better than the alternative. The manifest authentication, she said. The figure in room 4 mentioned a window closing. They were trying to reach the evidence before it could be authenticated by an external body. The authentication isn't an issue, Hollis said. The financial records on the drives are self-authenticating. The account structures are tied to program designators that only exist in classified DoD systems, and the records themselves show transfers that never appeared on any authorized budget. We don't need a witness to authenticate them. They authenticate themselves. A pause. We needed Cray alive to testify to the chain of custody of his own investigation. That's why they kept trying to reach him. She thought about that. And the testimony from the 9 detained personnel. Yes, once the rescue team extracts them, their testimony, combined with the manifest and the financial records, closes every available exit. She looked at Cray, who had been listening to her half of the conversation, with the focused attention of someone who had spent weeks running an investigation alone and was now watching it resolve through channels he'd had to trust other people to operate. "It's moving," she said to him. "How far?" "Far enough." She looked at the tablet. "Put the feed away. You need to keep your blood pressure below the threshold that's going to cause Ostrowski to have a professional crisis." He didn't put the feed away, but he did lower it. "Aldis," he said. "You know the name. From briefings. 5 years ago, he was lower ranked. He's been running this for at least 3 years, Cray said. Maybe longer. The program that the 9 personnel had access to it was authorized initially as a legitimate black budget intelligence program. Signals collection, nothing unusual. Aldis inherited command of it and spent 18 months converting it into something else. He stopped to breathe. The money. That's what it was always about. The program's black budget allocations were being siphoned, not all of it, not obviously, but systematically. Small enough percentages that the audit mechanisms didn't flag them. Redirected into accounts that funded operations that didn't exist on any authorized roster. What operations? I don't know all of them. The manifest is what I could confirm. The financial records go further than I could fully trace. He looked at her. But the 9 people in that room asked questions about the money. That's what connected them. They weren't whistleblowers. Most of them were junior enough that they didn't fully understand what they'd seen. They just asked the wrong questions of the wrong people. She sat with that for a moment. 9 people who had asked questions, and the answer had been a concrete room with controlled lighting in a facility that officially had no record of their presence. "When this is over," she said, "you're going to need to be very specific in your testimony about the chain of events. Every decision you made, every piece of evidence, every person you contacted, and when. The defense will look for any gap. I know. Your off-book investigation is going to be questioned. The admissibility of the recordings. I had legal guidance," he said, "from a JAG officer who is now also in protective custody, because she was the first person I told. And telling her was how I confirmed the penetration in the official channels. She went to the Inspector General's office through proper procedure, and the referral disappeared." He paused. "That disappearance is also in the record." She looked at him. For a man who had been shot twice and had spent 3 days in a hospital bed fighting for his life between assassination attempts, he had constructed something thorough. "You built this carefully," she said. "I had 9 people in a room on a feed. I couldn't act on alone," he said. Careful was the only option. Cassell's phone rang. He answered. "Listen for 20 seconds, said 2 words, and ended the call. He looked at the rearview mirror. "Hollis wants us back at Calloway," he said. "Federal oversight team has arrived on site. They want Cray's formal statement, and they want it documented under oversight supervision before Aldis's legal team can move on a preliminary injunction." "How long before the injunction attempt?" Hollis said his estimate is 90 minutes. Aldis was transported 40 minutes ago, which means his legal representation has been notified, and the injunction filing is the first move. 90 minutes, Cray said. He sounded tired, the sustainable kind of tired, that came after extended high-functioning stress, not the dangerous kind. "I can do 90 minutes. You can do 30, Petra said. "A statement takes 30 if we keep it focused. It's my statement. And it's your myocardial function," she said. "We'll keep it focused." They brought Cray back into Calloway through the loading dock, the same entry she'd used twice which was now being monitored by a federal marshal who checked their identification with the efficiency of someone who had received very recent and very specific instruction. The SICU had been cleared and resecured by the time they returned. Ostrowski was waiting in the corridor with an expression that contained several days' worth of professionally suppressed alarm compressed into one look. His oxygen saturation, she said to Petra, not asking assessing. He's been ambulatory for approximately 40 minutes. The IV site bled for about 8 of those. His breathing has been controlled. I'm standing here, Cray said. I know, Admiral, Ostrowski said, in the tone of a physician who had reached the point where titles were a courtesy and directness was a necessity. And in about 10 minutes, I'm going to need you to be lying down again, because your chest tube site is not happy, and I'd like to know about it before it becomes a problem rather than after. She looked at Petra. He goes in room 6. He gives whatever statement is required. And then I need 45 minutes of clinical assessment that nobody from any federal office interrupts. 45 is a lot, Hollis said, appearing from the direction of the nursing station. He looked like a man who had been running on adrenaline and institutional obligation for the last 4 hours, and was not going to admit it. 45, Ostrowski said again, and said nothing else, because the nothing else was more effective than an argument. Hollis looked at Petra. We'll take 30 in the room, and then you go in with the clinical team. Understood, Petra said. You're still technically suspended, Hollis said. He said it the way you say something that is technically true and practically irrelevant. I know. I'm going to need you in that room during the statement. You were present at Caldwell County. You handled the manifest before it was logged, and your testimony about the sequence of events from the SICU forward is part of the chain of custody record. I understand. So the suspension, handle it after the statement, she said. One thing at a time. He almost smiled. It was a brief and complicated almost, but it was there. The statement took 34 minutes. The statement's precise and sequential, and spoke without notes, which was either impressive or stubborn, and she thought it was both. The federal oversight representative, a woman in her 50s named Hargrove, who had the demeanor of someone who had sat in rooms with dangerous information long enough that nothing surprised her anymore, asked 17 questions and wrote the answers in longhand, which was unusual and which Petra suspected was intentional on Hargrove's part. Longhand notes couldn't be accessed by a network penetration. When it was done, Ostrowski's clinical team came in and Petra stepped out. In the corridor, Hollis stood beside her and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Aldis's legal team filed the injunction 32 minutes ago, he said, attempting to suppress the financial records on grounds of improper collection. Will it hold? For about 6 hours. The Oversight Committee chair is already in contact with the federal court. The counter-filing is done. He paused. The rescue operation reached the facility 40 minutes ago. All 9 personnel are confirmed alive. 2 require immediate medical attention. The others they're going to need time, but they're physically intact. She looked at the wall. 9 people who had asked questions and ended up in a concrete room. Coming out now, through a door that had taken months to reach, Cray's months spent building a record that couldn't be dismissed from a hospital bed, through multiple assassination attempts. Using a ghost he'd refused to stop believing was still out there. The figure from room 4, she said, the one I restrained, in federal custody. He's a contractor, no military affiliation, hired through a cutout that traces back to one of Aldis's redirected accounts. Hollis paused. He's talking. Contractors usually do. What's he saying? Enough. He turned slightly toward her. Commander Voss. Your record, the casualty notification, the classified file. I can begin the process of restoring your official status. It'll take time. There's a protocol, but it can be initiated. She looked at him. Not tonight. No, not tonight. He paused. But soon, she thought about the name. Lydia Voss, on a casualty notification letter, in a file that required deputy director clearance. Commander Lydia Voss, whose last official act was in a valley that she was not supposed to have survived, doing something she was not supposed to have needed to do, and then disappearing into the quiet, careful architecture of Nurse Petra Walsh for 5 years. She thought about the name in a different way than she'd allowed herself to think about it in a long time. Soon, she said. At 5:15 a.m., Castle found her in the break room. She was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk and a view of the east corridor through the interior window, watching the overnight staff start the handoff process, slightly process, with the slightly dazed efficiency of people who had worked through an extraordinary night without full information about what had made it extraordinary. He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything immediately, which was one of the things she'd noted about him. Across the last 36 hours, he understood the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that didn't. The 2 officers from the SICU lobby, she said, the ones Cray identified. Are they talking? One of them. The other is lawyered up. He wrapped his hands around a coffee mug. The one who's talking identified Aldous directly. Received tasking through a communications channel that the federal team is currently pulling apart. He paused. He also said something else. She looked at him. He said the original plan, the first assassination attempt 6 weeks ago, wasn't Aldis's initiative. He was responding to an instruction from someone above him in the structure. Castle set down the mug. Aldis was running the program and running the money, but the order to eliminate Cray came from above. She was very still. Above Aldis, she said. That's what he said. A vice admiral commanding an entire theater is not a man with a lot of people above him. No, Cassell said, he's not. She looked at the east corridor. The night nurses were finishing their handoffs. In room 6, Cray was sleeping under Ostrowski's watchful clinical management, with 2 federal marshals outside the door who had been verified through the Oversight Committee's own roster. Hollis was somewhere in the building, filing documentation. Hargrove was in a conference room on the first floor, with a secure phone and a set of longhand notes. Everything that had been set in motion tonight was moving. The financial records, the manifest, the contractor's statement, the testimony of 9 people who had spent months in a concrete room and were now in medical facilities being processed back into a world that would have to reckon with what had been done to them. It was moving. But Cassell had just told her that the man whose name was on the manifest had been responding to an instruction from somewhere higher in the architecture, which meant the manifest was not the top, which meant the 6-week campaign against Cray, the 7-year positioning of Delia Farrow inside Calloway, the synthetic compound, and the signals intelligence and the state-level resourcers, all of it originated not with the theater commander running a financial scheme, but with something above a theater commander. She picked up the coffee. It was cold. Does Hollis know? She said. I called him before I came in here. What did he say? Castle looked at her across the table. He said Hargrove's been on the phone for the last 20 minutes. He said the Oversight Committee chair just requested an emergency closed-door session for 800 this morning. He paused. He said to tell you that the scope of this is larger than what we've documented, and that what we've documented is already the largest internal corruption case the Atlantic Command structure has seen in 30 years. She set down the coffee. Larger than what they'd documented. 9 people in a concrete room, 3 assassination attempts on a flag officer, a 7-year intelligence asset embedded in a military hospital, a theater commander serving as an instrument of an architecture that went further up than he went. She thought about the contingency that had positioned Farrow here 7 years ago, before Cray's investigation, before the 9 detentions, before any of the specific events that had apparently triggered the elimination campaign. 7 years ago, someone had looked at Calloway Military Medical Center and decided it was worth placing a long-term asset inside it. Not because of something that was happening then, because of something they were planning for later. That kind of planning didn't belong to a theater commander. That kind of planning belonged to something that thought in longer timelines and operated with a scope of resources that made a black budget financial diversion look like operational pocket change. Hollis wants you at the 800 session, Cassell said. She looked at him. As Commander Voss, he said, not as Nurse Walsh. Hargrove specifically requested your presence because your testimony covers a segment of the chain of events that nobody else in the room can account for. She thought about sitting in a room at 800 with a congressional oversight representative and a federal team, and being introduced as Commander Lydia Voss rather than Nurse Petra Walsh, and what that introduction would mean for the identity she had built and the life she had lived inside it for 5 years. She thought about Cray in the stairwells, saying, whatever they told you about Panjashir, I'd like to know when this is over. She thought about the 9 people coming out of a concrete room. Tell Hollis yes, she said. Cassell nodded. He didn't make anything of the moment, which was the right call, and she appreciated it. At 2 a.m., as the day shift was beginning to filter in and the overnight staff was heading to the parking structure with the particular exhaustion of people who had worked through a night, they'd be explaining. For weeks, Hollis appeared in the break room doorway. He looked at Petra with the expression of someone who's just received information that requires immediate communication and is deciding how to frame it. The contractor, he said. The one from room 4 who's been talking. He paused. He just gave us a name. The instruction above Aldous. The origin point. She waited. It's not a military position, Hollis said. He looked slightly like a man who had been certain about the shape of something and had just discovered the shape was wrong. It's a civilian appointment, Senate confirmed. He looked at her steadily. The Oversight Committee chair, who's been managing this response since midnight, who Hargrove reports to, who called in the rescue operation, who is convening the 800 session. The break room was very quiet. She's the origin point, Petra said. She's the origin point, Hollis said. Outside in the corridor, the day shift moved past the break room window with coffee cups and stethoscopes and the ordinary morning business of a military hospital coming back to operational capacity. And none of them knew that in the room off the corridor, the architecture of an investigation that had just dismantled a vice admiral's criminal network had cracked open one more level and revealed something that made the last 36 hours look like the visible surface of a very deep problem. The 800 session, Petra said. She's running it. Yes. Who else knows? You, me, the contractor's federal handler, and Cassell. He paused. Hargrove doesn't know. She's been reporting to the committee chair for 4 years. She looked at the cold coffee on the table. We have 2 hours, she said. Yes. Then we need to use them. 2 hours was not enough time to do this correctly. It was, however, enough time to do it adequately, and adequate was what the situation could support. Hollis spent the first 20 minutes on the phone with the federal court liaison, working through the procedural mechanics of what happened when the person overseeing his investigation was identified as a participant in the thing being investigated. It was not a simple problem. The oversight structure existed precisely to prevent the kind of unilateral action that the current situation seemed to demand. And the irony of that the safeguard was, the threat was not lost on either of them, but irony didn't solve the problem of Senator Marin Vole walking into a secure conference room at 800 with full committee authority and a 4-year relationship with Hargrove that had just been revealed as something other than what it appeared. Petra spent those same 20 minutes thinking about what Vole would do when she arrived and found the session had been restructured without her authorization. The answer was that she would do what people in positions of institutional power always did when cornered. She would assert the authority of her position as a weapon. She would argue procedure, and she would buy time for her legal infrastructure to construct a defense. The contractor's statement was damaging, but not yet formally entered. The financial records were authenticated, but not yet in a jurisdiction she couldn't touch. The manifest had Aldis's name, not hers. She needed a link, something that placed Voll's fingerprints on the operational decision-making, rather than simply on the structural position above the man who'd signed the document. She thought about the communications channel that Aldis's officer had used, the one the federal team was pulling apart. She thought about what Hollis had said, that Aldis was responding to an instruction, not initiating one. An instruction left a record, even in systems designed to minimize records, because instructions required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required a return channel, and return channels left metadata, even when the content was scrubbed. She went to find the federal team's signals analyst. His name was Peretti, and he was 28 years old and had been running metadata extraction on Aldis's communications network for the last hour in a converted supply closet on the first floor, with 3 laptops and an expression of concentrated focus that didn't waver when she walked in. The return channel on the instruction to Aldis, she said. The originating node. Can you place it geographically? He looked at her. Who are you? Someone Hollis told to ask you this question. He looked at his screen. The originating node is anonymized through 4 layers. I can tell you the penultimate layer is a Senate office building communications relay. He paused. Which is consistent with a Senate committee operation, or consistent with someone using a Senate office building relay as a known anonymization point, because they know we'd be reluctant to pursue it past that layer. Can you get past that layer? Technically, yes. Jurisdictionally, I need authorization from Hollis, she said. Call him right now, Peretti called him. Hollis gave the authorization in 40 seconds, which meant he'd already been thinking about the same problem from the other end and was waiting for the request. Peretti went back to his screens, and Petra stood behind him and watched the process, which was not fast and was not simple, and at the 38-minute mark produced a result that was a specific Senate Office Terminal identifier attached to a specific user login that matched a member of Senator Voll's permanent staff. Not Voll herself, her staff. Is that enough? Peretti said. It's a staff member's login, she said. Defense will argue the senator wasn't personally responsible for her staff members' communications. The login was accessed from a device registered to the senator's personal account, Peretti said. He pointed at a secondary line in the metadata output. The staff member's credentials were used from a device that isn't the staff member's device. She looked at the screen. Her device, Petra said. Her device, he confirmed. She straightened up. Print that. Everything. Send a copy to Hollis and a copy to the federal court liaison and a copy to Hargrove's personal email, not her office account. She paused. And put a copy on a drive that you keep on your person until this session is over. He was already printing. At 7:44 a.m., 16 minutes before the scheduled 800 session, Petra walked into the conference room on the second floor where Hargrove was reviewing her longhand notes with a second cup of coffee and the focused stillness of someone preparing for what she expected to be a complex but manageable proceeding. Petra sat down across from her and put Peretti's printout on the table and gave Hargrove 4 minutes to read it. Hargrove read it twice. Her expression during the first read was professional neutrality. During the second read, something shifted underneath the neutrality, not surprise exactly, but the specific recalibration of someone whose understanding of a situation has just been structurally altered. You're certain about the device registration, Hargrove said. The analyst is certain. The documentation is in the federal court liaison's hands as of 8 minutes ago. Hargrove set down the paper. She looked at the wall for a moment. 4 years of reporting to a committee chair, 4 years of briefings and oversight sessions and institutional trust, and the printout on the table said that some portion of those 4 years had been operating inside a structure that was managing the investigation it was supposed to be supervising. She'll walk in at 800, Hargrove said, and she'll expect to run the session. Yes. If I restructure the session before she arrives, she'll know immediately that something has changed. Yes, and if I wait until she's in the room. Then you control the moment, Petra said. And she doesn't have time to prepare a response before the documentation is already on the record. Hargrove looked at her. You've done this before. Done what? Sat in a room and identified the precise moment when the situation tips. She paused. You're not a nurse. I'm a lot of things, Petra said. Right now I'm someone who needs you to be in that room at 800 with the full documentation package and the authority to enter it into record before anyone can object. Hargrove picked up the printout. I'll need Hollis in the room. He'll be there. And Admiral Cray? His cardiologist is going to object. I know. Is he going to be there? Petra thought about Cray in the stairwell, sitting on the stairs with a makeshift dressing on his IV site, holding a tablet showing 9 faces in a concrete room, saying, careful was the only option. He'll be there, she said. Senator Maren Vole arrived at 8:02 a.m. She was 63 years old and had the kind of presence that came from decades of operating in rooms where presence was a professional tool. Silver hair, dark suit, with a particular quality of composed authority that was indistinguishable from confidence until you knew what to look for underneath it. She walked into the conference room, registered the composition of the people already seated, and in the half-second before her expression settled, Petra saw it, the assessment, rapid and complete, and the conclusion that the assessment produced, which was that the room was not configured the way she'd expected. She sat down at the head of the table, because the head of the table was where she always sat, and she opened her briefing folder, and she said, let's begin with the status of the Aldous detention and the authentication timeline for the financial records. We'll get to those, Hargrove said. I'd like to start with something that came in this morning. She put Peretti's printout on the table and slid it toward Vole. The room was very quiet. Vole looked at the printout. She didn't pick it up immediately. She looked at it from where it lay, the way someone looks at something they've been calculating the arrival of and have spent time deciding how to respond to when it comes. Then she picked it up and read it, and her face did something controlled and deliberate and not quite sufficient. This is metadata from an anonymous relay, she said. The attribution to a specific device is an analytical inference, not a verified. The device registration is verified, Hollis said from his seat at the table. The federal court has the verification documentation as of 7:36 this morning. Vole set the printout down. She looked at Hollis, then at Hargrove, then briefly, precisely at Petra. The look lasted half a second and contained a full assessment. I'd like to consult with counsel before this session. Continues, she said. You have that right, Hargrove said. The session will be recessed for that purpose. However, I want to advise you that the federal court liaison has been notified and the documentation package is already entered into the preliminary record under the court's jurisdiction. A recess doesn't affect that entry. Vole was silent for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Petra watched the structure of Maren Vole's position collapse from the inside. Not dramatically. People like Vole didn't collapse dramatically. They recalculated. They looked for exits. They managed the tempo of their own downfall with the same professionalism they'd applied to everything else. But the exits weren't there, and the calculation didn't produce a workable result. And the 3 seconds ended with a woman who understood, with the complete clarity of someone who had spent decades reading rooms, that the room she was in had no exit she hadn't already foreclosed. Recess, she said. The session recessed. She did not return. At 9:17 a.m., federal marshals arrived at the building, and Senator Maren Vole was transported for formal questioning. Her legal team filed 3 separate motions in the subsequent 2 hours, all of which were opposed by the federal court liaison, using documentation that had been assembled through a night of work by people who had no institutional loyalty to the structure Vole had spent years carefully maintaining. None of the motions held. The 9 personnel extracted from the detention facility arrived at medical facilities within the Atlantic region over the following 18 hours. Their conditions ranged from physically intact, but psychologically fractured, to requiring immediate intervention for medical issues that had developed during their detention. All 9 were alive. All 9 were eventually able to speak. Their testimony, combined with the financial records, the manifest, Cray's documented chain of evidence, and the device metadata, placing Vol at the originating node of the instruction to Aldous, built a case that the federal prosecutor's office described in their internal briefing as comprehensive to an unusual degree. Aldous was charged on 11 counts. Vol was charged on 7. The contractors involved in the assassination attempts faced federal charges that included conspiracy and attempted murder of a flag officer. The analyst in Hollis's office, who had flagged the off-channel communications to Aldous's network, was charged separately. The staff member whose login credentials had been used from Vol's device was not charged. She had not known what her credentials were being used for, and the evidence made that clear. Delia Farrow, the nurse who had been positioned inside Calloway for 7 years, was charged with conspiracy and attempted murder. During her arraignment, she said nothing. Her background, when it was fully pulled, showed a recruitment that had happened before she ever applied to Calloway, a financial pressure point, a contact made through a cutout, a long patience. She was a tool who had been placed and left, activated, and that was its own kind of thing to reckon with. And Petra reckoned with it in the way she reckoned with most things, privately, without making it someone else's problem, without arriving at a clean conclusion. The program that the 9 personnel had asked questions about was suspended pending a full audit. 3 other personnel who had been listed as AWOL or medically separated were located too in situations that required legal remediation. 1 who had left voluntarily and had simply not been found because no one had looked hard enough. The financial diversion from the black budget allocations was traced through 6 layers of accounts and recovered to a degree that the auditors described as better than typical for this kind of scheme, which was a way of saying that not everything was recovered and some portion of it had moved through channels that were difficult to trace, and that imperfect recovery was still recovery. It was not a clean resolution. Clean resolutions belong to stories about simpler problems, and this was not a simple problem. It was, however, a resolution. On a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the 800 session, Petra sat in a chair in Dr. Burroughs' office and waited for him to finish reading the document that Hollis had sent to hospital administration the previous afternoon. The document was a formal communication from the Federal Oversight Office describing the assistance provided by a consultant operating under temporary credentials at Calloway Military Medical Center, and it used language that was specific enough to be informative and restrained enough to leave certain details to the reader's inference. It also included a formal request that the hospital administration review the suspension action taken against the consultant during the relevant period. Burroughs finished reading. He set the document on his desk. He looked at it for a moment. "Nurse Walsh," he said, and then stopped, because the document had made the name technically complicated. "Walsh is fine," she said. He looked at her. In 22 years of trauma medicine, she thought, he had probably not sat in this office across from someone whose personnel file had just been revealed to contain a classified redaction the size of a career. The particular quality of his discomfort was the discomfort of a man who had been confidently wrong and knew it, and was trying to decide what to do with that. "The competency review," he said. "The suspension." "Yes." He stopped. "I made assessments based on what I observed, and what I observed was inconsistent with the file you presented." "My file was constructed to be inconsistent," she said. "That was deliberate, and it was my choice, and the professional friction that resulted from it was a foreseeable consequence." She paused. "You did your job. You saw a discrepancy, and you flagged it." He looked at her for a moment. "I was unkind," he said. "Specifically, in front of residents. I was unkind in a way that wasn't about the discrepancy. He stopped again. I don't know what it was about. It doesn't matter now. It matters to me, he said. He said it quietly and without the professional architecture he normally operated behind, and she recognized it for what it was. A man being honest in a room where honesty cost him something. I'm sorry. She looked at him. She thought about 14 months of keeping her head down and her shoulders in, and her tremor visible and her confidence invisible. 14 months of being described as someone to be tolerated. 14 months of the small grinding work of being underestimated in order to stay safe. Apology accepted, she said. Genuinely. He nodded. She stood up. The suspension should be formally cleared from the record. For the institution's purposes. It will be, he said. I'll process it today. She left his office and walked down the corridor of Calloway Military Medical Center for what she already knew was one of the last times. The overhead lights had the same fluorescent quality they'd always had. The supply room door stuck the same way. Alonzo Park was at the nursing station with a chart and a coffee. And he looked up when she passed, and his expression was complicated in the way of someone who has been asking questions for 3 weeks and has received answers that raised further questions. Walsh, he said. Park, are you coming back? She stopped. She thought about it. No, she said. He nodded slowly. Can I ask? No, she said, but not unkindly. Take care of yourself. You're a good nurse. He looked at her. You were too, he said. Whatever else you are, you were that. She took the elevator down and walked out through the main entrance. For the first time, she'd always used the east wing entrance, the less trafficked one, the one that suited the profile she'd been maintaining. The main entrance had glass doors and morning light coming through them, and she walked through it and stood on the steps outside and breathed the October air that had turned cold overnight. Castle was at the bottom of the steps. He wasn't in his security uniform. He was in street clothes, a jacket against the cold, standing with his hands in his pockets, in the manner of someone who has been waiting and is comfortable with the waiting. They offered me a position, he said when she reached him. Federal Oversight Liaison, Hospital Security Coordination. Basically doing what I was already doing, but with better communication channels and a federal ID. Are you taking it? Probably. He looked at her. What about you? She thought about what Hollis had said, about the formal process of restoring her official status. She thought about Cray, who was recovering at a pace that was slower than he wanted and faster than Ostrowski had projected, which was consistent with everything she knew about him. She thought about the 9 people coming out of a concrete room and the long work of putting themselves back together. There's been a conversation, she said, about a training position. Combat trauma. Teaching medics and special operations personnel how to manage casualties in field conditions. Teaching, Castle said. I'm apparently qualified. He almost smiled. Apparently. It's not field work, she said. It's structured, it has regular hours and a permanent address and a chain of command I'm supposed to actually operate within. How do you feel about that? She thought about it honestly. About 5 years of careful invisibility, of making herself small enough to disappear, of the particular exhaustion of maintaining a persona built entirely on limitation. About what it had cost, not just professionally, but in the daily granular way, the conversations she'd shut down, the moments she'd deflected, the things she'd known and kept in the narrow interior space she'd had to preserve for the truth of herself. I think, she said, that I've been small for a long time on purpose, and I'm tired of the purpose. Cassell was quiet for a moment. That's a yes. That's a yes, she said. 6 weeks later, the formal restoration of her military record was processed through the appropriate channels and signed by an authority whose signature no longer carried the institutional weight it had carried. 6 weeks prior, because the authority in question was cooperating with federal prosecutors in exchange for a sentencing consideration that her legal team was still negotiating. The casualty notification letter in Commander Lydia Voss's file was formally rescinded. Her record was restored with the complete service history that 5 years of classified redaction had removed. The citation she'd received for the Panjshir operation, the one that had officially ended with her death, was restored to the record with a classification level that meant it would never be publicly detailed, which was fine. She hadn't done it for the citation. Cray attended the administrative proceeding by video from his recovery location. He wore his uniform. He looked like a man who was getting better at a pace that satisfied no one, least of all himself. The slight impatience in his face when the administrative formalities ran long was the most reassuring thing she'd seen in weeks. When the proceeding concluded, he said, "Welcome back, Commander." She said, "Get some rest, Admiral." He said, "I'll rest when the 9 have testified." "They've testified," she said. 3 of them have already testified. Rest. He conceded the point with the reluctant precision of a man who has been told the same pleasant true thing enough times that continued refusal would be performative rather than principled. The training facility was called the Brannock Combat Medicine Institute, located on the outskirts of Whitmore, Virginia, and it had the functional aesthetic of a place that had been built for purpose rather than appearance. Low structures, practical materials, a training yard that showed the evidence of sustained heavy use. The kind of place that didn't need to look like anything, because the work it did was the point. She arrived on a Monday in December. The program director, a retired colonel named Sasha Burnett, met her at the entrance with a handshake and a directness that she appreciated immediately. Burnett had run combat trauma training for 11 years and had opinions about how it should be done that she communicated without apology, and she wanted to know Petra's own opinions before she put her in front of a class, which was the right instinct professionally. They talked for 2 hours. At the end of the 2 hours, Burnett said, "You're going to push back on the existing curriculum." "Parts of it," Petra said. "Which parts?" "The parts that assume the medic knows what environment they're walking into." She paused. "The environment is never what you expect. The training should build for that." Burnett looked at her for a moment. "When can you start?" "I already did," Petra said. The first class was a group of 16 candidates, a mix of military medics and special operations personnel from 3 different service branches, ranging from genuinely experienced to technically competent, but untested. They filed into the training room on a Tuesday morning with the particular combination of readiness and performance that people brought to new situations where they were being observed, and she stood at the front of the room and looked at them and thought about 14 months of making herself invisible in a hospital corridor. She didn't make herself invisible now. "My name is Commander Lydia Voss," she said. "Some of you may have a background on me. If you do, set it aside. What I did before this room is not what this room is about." She looked at the group. "What this room is about is the person who's already wounded when you arrive. The person whose survival depends on what you do in the first 4 minutes in conditions you didn't choose, with equipment that isn't sufficient, in a situation that's still actively dangerous." She paused. "I have been that person's medic. I have also been that person. I know what it looks like from both sides. We're going to train from both sides." No one spoke. They were listening with the quality of attention that meant they were actually present and not simply occupying the room. And she recognized it from the right direction for the first time in years, not as someone trying to go unnoticed in the back of it, but as the person it was directed toward. She taught the first session without notes. She taught it the way she'd learned the material in the field, under pressure, with the understanding that procedural knowledge was only the beginning, and that the rest was built in the gap between procedure and reality, where most training failed to go. At the end of 3 hours, she dismissed the class and stood in the empty room for a moment. Her shoulders still ached from the stairwell impact. The cut on her left foot had healed clean, but left a scar she'd feel in cold weather. She was 34 years old and had been declared dead, and had lived as someone else for 5 years, and had come back into herself not through a single dramatic moment, but through a series of small decisions that accumulated until there was no going back, which was how most things actually happened in her experience. regardless of how they looked from the outside. She was not the same person who had gone into that valley. She was not the same person who had walked into Calloway's trauma bay on her first day with her shoulders deliberately hunched and her confidence deliberately buried. She was something that had come through both of those and was still standing, imperfectly and with full knowledge of the imperfection, which was the only kind of standing that meant anything. She picked up her jacket and walked out of the training room. In the courtyard, two of the candidates were already running the obstacle course, not because they'd been told to, but because they were the kind of people who ran obstacle courses voluntarily, which was either admirable or compulsive, and was probably both. She watched them for a moment. There was a version of herself that had spent 5 years believing that the most valuable thing she could do was disappear, that the safest contribution was no contribution, that staying small was the same as staying safe, and that safe was the same as fine. She understood now, more clearly than she had at any point during those 5 years, that she had been wrong. Not about the danger had been real, and the choices she'd made inside it had kept her alive. But about the cost of disappearing, which was not just personal. The 9 people in the concrete room had needed someone who was willing to not disappear. Cray had needed someone who remembered a call sign and could say it in a room full of people without calculating whether it was safe first. The people in that training room would need someone who showed them what it actually looked like to keep when the situation had already exceeded every scenario they'd prepared for. You could not teach that from a position of careful invisibility. You could only teach it from a position of having been through it and survived it and chosen to be honest about what surviving it actually required. She walked back toward the main building. The air was cold, and the sky was the flat gray of a Virginia December, and her shoulder ached, and her scar pulled slightly at the edge of her eyebrow, the way it always did in cold weather. And she was exactly where she was supposed to be, which was not something she had been able to say at any point in the last 5 years. She had been a soldier who operated in the dark, in the spaces between what was official and what was necessary. She had been a ghost, small and careful, invisible, in the long gray middle of survival. She had been the nurse that nobody looked at twice, the one with the shaky hands and the mislabeled specimens and the apologetic deflections. And she had held that performance together through 14 months of daily indignity without losing the thing underneath it. And now she was none of those things and all of them, standing in a courtyard in December, about to go inside and plan the next day's curriculum for 16 people who needed to learn how to bring the wounded home alive. She was Commander Lydia Voss. She had stopped hiding. Not because it was safe, it still wasn't entirely safe, and it probably never would be entirely anything. Because that was the nature of a world where people like Aldous and Vole existed and built their structures quietly and patiently over years. But because the alternative, the long, careful, invisible silence, someone who had decided that disappearing was the price of safety, had turned out to be something she could not sustain indefinitely and did not want to. The people who had underestimated her had done so because she'd let them. She'd constructed the underestimation deliberately, maintained it faithfully, and found at the end of it that the most powerful thing she possessed was not the ability to be invisible, but the ability to be exactly who she was, fully and without apology, in whatever room she walked into. That was not a lesson she'd been taught. It was a lesson she'd had to get shot at to learn, which was an expensive way to learn anything. But the understanding it produced was the kind that didn't fade. She went inside. There was work to do,